Welcome to MysteryCon. We hope you're all doing well and living fully. Something beneath us was never meant to be seen because the moment we notice it, it notices back. If this stirred a memory you can't quite place, don't forget to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and let us know in the comments where you're watching from before it all disappears. My name is Elena Voss. I used to sign my name on documents no one ever read, certifying that nothing was wrong in places no one was allowed to look. I thought I was helping the planet. I was just helping it lie to itself. They said we were safeguarding the environment, but we were just laundering guilt, report by report, signature by signature. I didn't ask questions. Not until the brief arrived that wasn't supposed to. I was in the 7th year of a job that paid well and asked little of my conscience. My role, officially, was Environmental Ethics Officer, stationed out of a clean, sunless corporate floor in Toronto, reviewing impact assessments for Arctic operations. In practice, I rubber-stamped post-dated PDFs while satellite data was quietly scrubbed in the background. It was efficient, forgettable. Then came the anomaly, a hydrology report marked urgent, buried in a batch from Sector 4M Delta near the Antarctic Convergence. It had no cover sheet, just raw telemetry and a corrupted video file with no metadata. That's what caught my eye. The data showed pressure fluctuations, massive, sudden ones, beneath a mapped glacial crust over a lake that didn't exist on any previous chart. There was a 13-second video attached, black and white, blurry. The submersible light caught something moving just at the edge of visibility. It didn't swim. It resisted, as if trying not to float. A figure, pale, limbless, in the wrong places. Long-armed, wrong-angled, no eyes, no features, just shape and motion, then static. The file was signed off by a junior hydrologist named Takeda. I remembered him from one of the 2012 seasonal briefings. Smart, precise. The personnel database said he'd been terminated 2 weeks before the footage was logged. I sent a request for clarification to compliance records, just routine protocol. By the time I got home that night, my passkey had stopped working. The locks on my apartment had been changed. My work laptop reformatted itself when I tried to boot it offline. Within 48 hours, I was transferred to internal review, which meant nothing. My name vanished from the employee portal. My credentials were scrubbed. The only thing that remained was the image burned into my memory. That shape in the water, that inhuman stillness, and the realization that someone, somewhere, didn't want me asking what it was. Not because it was too dangerous, but because it was already known. I told myself it was just an error, a missed flag in the clearance system, maybe a corrupted badge reader. Bureaucracies break quietly all the time, but the more I tried to re-enter my life, the less of it responded. The first day, I assumed it was a security audit. By the second, my inbox returned empty. My credentials failed re-authentication. The internal HR portal treated my ID number like a typo. No alerts, no denial, just blank fields where my name used to be. When I called the compliance help desk from a personal line, it routed me to an offshore receptionist. She took my name. There was silence. Then she asked for a current internal liaison. I gave her 3. She repeated, "No record found," and asked if I'd made the call by mistake. Her tone wasn't robotic, just indifferent, like she'd been trained not to engage. That night, my access fob failed at my apartment gate. The keypad still lit up. The screen still read, "Welcome," but the lock didn't click. I had to wait for a neighbor to exit before slipping inside. My unit looked untouched. My hard drives weren't gone, they were just blank. Not wiped, but as if they'd never been written to. It didn't feel like an attack, it felt like being revised. No one confronted me, no threats, no deletions I could prove. Just a clean removal from systems designed to forget what didn't validate. And that was the first real signal. Someone wanted me to notice, but not too fast. I was being taught something. Not warned, not punished, shown. This wasn't about the video, it was about the breach I'd caused by seeing it. The structure wasn't deleting data, it was correcting deviation. And the correction had started with me. I spent the next 3 weeks living in borrowed spaces, sublets, motels, anywhere that didn't require a real name. I stopped using cards and kept my phone powered down unless I needed to check secure forums. Most of the people I contacted ignored me. A few wrote back in clipped sentences, then stopped entirely after 1 or 2 exchanges. I didn't blame them. If I hadn't seen the footage, I wouldn't believe me either. But I wasn't looking for believers. I was looking for patterns. Ice lure kept turning up in places it shouldn't. A NOAA buoy near the Drake Passage flagged it in its system diagnostics. A satellite relay station in Nunavut listed it in its decommissioning file, and in the logs of an old research vessel, scrapped in 2009, I found it listed as the reason of early mission termination. No details, just one phrase. Exposure threshold reached. Ice lure compromised. Return to port. I started tracing the signal sources backwards, correlating them with temperature shifts and seismic pressure data. It wasn't perfect, but the scatter plot formed a loose perimeter, a kind of invisible boundary drawn across the southern oceans. And the strange thing was, nothing ever crossed into it. Not legally, at least. Shipping lanes detoured around it. Research permits got revoked without explanation. Satellite orbits bent ever so slightly to avoid its core. I wasn't the first to notice. In a university archive in Christchurch, I found a paper draft buried in an unlinked folder. It had never been published. The author was listed as E. Takeda, the same hydrologist whose name was on the video file. The paper was crude, no references, no peer review, but it described something almost identical to what I had seen. Anomalous mass displacement beneath ice, sudden shifts in subglacial salinity, pressure waves without origin. At the bottom of the file was a note. Contact is passive until pattern disruption. Do not acknowledge, do not reapproach. That's when it clicked. Ice lure wasn't a project. It was a protocol, a kind of containment rule. Not to protect us, but to protect something else from noticing we were here, and someone had built an entire system to enforce it. Once I understood what ice lure was, I started seeing it everywhere, in a mission. Entire data sets were structured to bypass the southern convergence. Hydroacoustic readings skipped frequency, bands without explanation. Subglacial terrain models stopped at the same arbitrary coordinates. No one was deleting data. They were building around it. That's what made it so effective. You couldn't trace what didn't officially exist. But I kept pulling the thread, and eventually I found a name buried in a cold regions research memo. From 1996, the Ningen Protocol. It wasn't a file, it wasn't even classified. It was a phrase buried in footnotes and email chains, always in lowercase, always vague. Once in a satellite relay, brief, describing anomalous signal drift. Once in an internal training manual, see Ningen Protocol for glacial breach contingency. It sounded like a joke at first. Ningen was the name of a Japanese sea legend, half myth, half iceberg. But the more I traced it, the clearer it became. It wasn't about a creature, it was about a rule, non-engagement. The documents never said what was being avoided, they only emphasized behavior. Do not observe, do not respond, do not name. That was the most consistent instruction, no naming, as if giving shape to what was under the ice could somehow activate it. I found one final reference in a backdoor server used by a disbanded French maritime institute. The file was audio only. No transcript. The voice was male, calm, older, maybe a researcher. He spoke softly, describing a failed drill descent into an unmapped trench. At 67 seconds, his voice broke. Not from fear, but recognition. He didn't say what he saw, he didn't need to. The transmission cut off mid-sentence. I listened to it 7 times. Each time, the silence after his voice ended felt heavier, like something was still listening. I stopped searching that night. Not because I was afraid of being found. I was afraid of what I might accidentally find, not information.
Not exposure. Awareness. That was the boundary we weren't supposed to cross. The threat wasn't what lived beneath the ice. It was what happened if it realized we were looking. I stopped trying to find the truth. My goal shifted to preserving
what I still knew. That meant staying quiet, moving often, and avoiding anything traceable. But it wasn't enough. One morning, my public records vanished. My driver's license expired in the system. My university email returned undeliverable. Even my medical files, basic, unremarkable, were flagged as unverified source. When I tried to log into my pension portal, I was prompted to verify my identity. The screen blinked, then nothing. That was when I realized this wasn't just a cover-up. It was a deletion. I wasn't being followed. I was being erased. It started subtle. Job applications went unanswered. Hotels claimed my cards were declined. Contacts I'd never even mentioned Islur to stopped responding entirely. Then the facial recognition failures began. At an old co-working space, the check-in tablet refused to scan my ID. It called for manual override. The attendant didn't. Looked twice, just told me I wasn't in the system. I left before he could call anyone. At a public library, I scanned an old staff badge for access to academic networks. The system locked. The monitor went black. A red bar flickered. Unauthorized pattern detected. Session terminated. I tried to reconnect with a friend from grad school. Someone who owed me nothing, someone I trusted. I used a clean account. Neutral. Language. No keywords. We met in a crowded cafe. At first, everything felt normal. She smiled. We hugged. We talked about old research, former professors. Then I brought up Takeda. Her face changed. Not fear, not recognition, nothing. She said she didn't remember him. Didn't remember working with me on the coastal ethics panel. Said I must be confusing her with someone else. But I knew her. I remembered the way she annotated articles with 3-color pens. I remembered her cat's name. Still, she looked through me like I was a stranger. I left before I could fall apart in front of her. Later that night, I tried to log into a secure forum I'd helped build in 2015. The server refused my fingerprint. It said I'd never registered, but I had. I was the moderator. I'd chosen the name myself. That's when I knew this wasn't surveillance. It was a final protocol. Not to kill me, to unmake me. There was no official chase, no black vans.
No threats, just silence. Institutions that had once validated my existence now responded with indifference or not at all.
I wasn't erased. I was being treated like a glitch, a mismatch between input and record. To test what was left of my presence, I visited an old colleague, Marcus, someone outside the corporate system. We used to speak in acronyms, drink at conferences, argue over audit thresholds. He ran a small university lab now. I waited outside his building after hours, careful not to trigger security cams. When he finally stepped out, I said his name. He paused, looked straight at me. No recognition. I told him a detail only he and I could know, a field report from 2015, the one with the falsified drone altitude. He smiled awkwardly and said I must be thinking of someone else. It was real, tangible human dismissal, not apathy, something deeper, a curated absence. I thanked him and left before my voice could crack. Later that night, I uploaded more fragments. I embedded metadata into dummy climate reports, mirrored corrupted files onto closed wikis. I posted audio distortions and packet hashes into channels where only 3 or 4 people might notice. I wasn't seeking exposure, I was planting signs for the few who already knew to look. Over time, others surfaced. A seismic analyst in Mendoza uploaded anomalous wave signatures. A linguist in Seoul shared a withdrawn study on subharmonic feedback patterns. We never addressed each other directly, that would be too dangerous. But the signals passed, quiet affirmations, that awareness hadn't been contained. Not fully. Ice Lure wasn't just a protocol, it was an idea reinforced by systems, incentives, architecture. Not to hide monsters, but to prevent awareness from accumulating. The threat wasn't biological, it was cognitive. We weren't supposed to see the shape forming in the data. We were supposed to look away, but I couldn't, not anymore. I live without expectation now, no employment, no records, no obligations. My world is measured in time zones and upload intervals, in burner networks and encryption keys I can't write down. I'm not hunted, not in the way people imagine. They don't need to chase me. The damage was never physical, it was structural. They hollowed out the framework of my life and left the shell standing. I still exist, technically, but only in the gaps. What I knew was too precise to discredit, too quiet to fear. So they left me out in the open, an echo no one could place. But I'm not broken, not entirely, there's freedom in the fracture. My thoughts are mine again, even if they're unstable. I speak in fragments, in layered files and disguised packets. I've learned how to pass information without triggering filters. I've learned which servers forget what they store. I've learned to live at the edges of identity, of cognition, of the map. The others, whoever they are, still post, not often. Just enough to remind me the protocol isn't perfect. It leaks not through oversight, but through pattern saturation. At some point, a containment system becomes so large, it starts feeding itself. Ice Lure wasn't built to hide creatures, it was built to prevent recognition, but that defense has a limit. And it's us. Curiosity isn't a flaw, it's a trajectory, a slow accumulation of questions that can't be unasked. Some nights I still dream about the footage. Not the figure itself, but the space around it. The way the light bent at the edges like the water was pushing back, like it didn't want to be seen. I used to think we were alone in our ignorance. Now I think we were taught to maintain it. Not by force, but by suggestion. Through protocol, culture, career. A system designed to keep us looking just far enough to feel enlightened, but never far enough to become aware. The ice never cracked, not physically, but we did, one by one. And in that break I found something else, not proof, not contact. Just the certainty that whatever lives beneath that pressure does not want us to know it knows. And that's why I keep writing. The coordinates were wrong, but the wreck was real. There was no reason the USS Cyclops should be down there, and no natural explanation for the glass casket it was entombed in. I first saw it in a buried FOIA appendix, thermal scans of an uncharted trench off the Brazilian coast. A bored analyst had flagged it as a calibration error, but I couldn't stop staring at the shape. It wasn't just the wreck itself, it was the material around it, a shell of cooled volcanic glass, seamless and intact. No volcanic activity had ever been recorded in that region. I ran geological overlays. Nothing matched. When I traced the file's metadata, 2 tags were redacted under a classification I didn't recognize. Gatewatch. I should have let it go. My name is Mara Bell, and at the time I was freelancing as a linguist and technical consultant for a naval defense subcontractor, semantic, parsing, forensic translation, synthetic code analysis. A week after I flagged the anomaly, a private contract dropped into my queue. No description. Just a date, a badge code, and a 1-line NDA longer than the Constitution. The briefing room was underground. No windows. The people there didn't give names, just showed me looping thermal footage of the wreck. One of them asked, "Do you believe language can be structural?" I said yes before I understood the stakes. They handed me a slide, a cross-section of the Cyclops hull. Under extreme magnification, there were recursive patterns embedded in the material itself, not etched, not applied, grown into the lattice. They weren't artistic, they were functional. The patterns followed a logic, self-modifying and modular, like syntax in motion. I thought it was a Cold War signal artifact, something experimental. Then I noticed the patterns referenced directions I couldn't define, terms like unlooping, fold-bound, inversion. They assigned me a secure terminal and told me to keep decoding. That was my entry point. And from the moment I saw that language, I stopped trusting my own memory. The lab had no windows and no clocks. My workstation was air-gapped, running on custom firmware. The shard I worked from, a fragment of the Cyclops hull, was suspended in something called a field-stabilized buffer. No explanation. The glyphs weren't carved or printed. They were volumetric, appearing only when viewed from precise angles. Under polarized light, they folded into each other like recursive instructions. I began mapping structures, translating symmetries. Within a week, I recognized a framework, not speech, but direction. These weren't messages, they were movement guides, not across geography, across geometry. I wasn't the only one decoding. Elias Kwan, a systems analyst with a background in computational linguistics, worked 2 terminals down. He approached one afternoon over coffee, murmured, "Your logs make more sense than mine," and walked away. We shared notes in passing. He was skeptical, called it compression noise or a scan glitch. But his confidence faded fast. By the end of the week, his posture had changed. He walked slower, blinked less. One afternoon, I noticed something strange. My terminal lagged when rendering certain sequences. The HVAC unit shut down during recursive playback. Notes I left on the whiteboard vanished overnight. One evening, I found a glyph drawn in marker on my desk, one I hadn't written. I showed it to Elias. He stared at it and said, "That's a verb, or maybe a loop." We didn't sleep much after that. We started keeping memory checks. A phrase we agreed.
On Velvet Echo.
If one of us forgot it, we'd know. That phrase became our anchor. Then one night I came home to find every drawer in my apartment open, nothing missing, just altered. The batteries in the smoke detector were gone. My hard drive was encrypted. With a key I hadn't created, I tried to call Elias. He didn't answer. The next morning, the buffer chamber was offline. The shard was gone. In its place sat an envelope marked Reassignment Gatewatch. Inside was a new badge, extended clearance, and a one-way flight to a classified site off the coast of São Vicente, Osiris South. I didn't pack much, just notes, no phone. The facility was half submerged, wrapped around the trench's edge like it was watching something sleep. My new task was translating signal bleed from failed deep-sea drones, telemetry that matched the shard's language, glyphs rendered in thermal maps and sonar blips. The syntax was identical, only now it was moving. Elias was still there, but different. We crossed paths in the hallway. I said, "Velvet Echo." He tilted his head and asked if I had him confused with someone else. I knew then that I had lost him. That night I opened my field notes. Half of them weren't in my handwriting. The phrasing was familiar, but the logic was warped, like someone had finished my thoughts before I wrote them. I started forgetting simple things. My brother's name, the color of my front door. A neuroscientist in the facility pulled me aside after a sleep study. He showed me a graph. "You're syncing," he said. "The signal's rewriting baseline. Recall, it's not deleting, it's correcting." I asked what that meant. He said, "Containment, you're drifting." The next morning, I found a word etched into my bathroom mirror. I hadn't written it. Comply. I started noticing things in the structure itself. Hallways that curved slightly but led nowhere. Stairs that returned you to your starting floor. Lang, the project lead, told me, "The geometry adapts. Stop treating the building like it's passive." He didn't elaborate. Our drones picked up more anomalies. Subsurface folds forming in pairs, vanishing just as quickly. They weren't natural features. They were engineered openings, gates. One drone reappeared seconds after disappearing, fused with a new material. Inside was a cube, pulsing at the same rate as the glyph recursion pattern. Lang called it the anchor. I was granted clearance to observe it directly. The object wasn't large, no bigger than a shoebox, but it wasn't inert. Its surface restructured under observation. When I stared too long, I felt pressure behind my eyes. Lang appeared behind the glass. "It's
Not a transmitter," he said.
It's a stabilizer. It's not asking to be found. It's asking not to be unsealed." I stopped questioning after that. The signal wasn't a mystery anymore. It was a command structure. We weren't decoding it. We were receiving it. When I passed Elias in the lab, I realized he was humming. A perfect 27.4-second interval. Sub-level 3 wasn't on the map. My badge stopped working everywhere else. The door opened to a corridor colder than the rest of the facility. Concrete, no cameras. At the end, another room. Inside, the anchor, suspended in fluid. It pulsed, matching my heart rate. I didn't blink. It felt expectant. Lang's voice came through the speaker. "The cube isn't sending messages, it's broadcasting thresholds. When those thresholds are crossed, the folds open." I asked if the Cyclops had triggered one. He nodded. They didn't sync, they were reconfigured. We weren't watching the gate. We were standing on the lid. That night, I saw Elias
Again. This time he stopped. Looked at me like he almost remembered. I said the phrase again, "Velvet Echo." He blinked, said nothing, and walked away. The anchor pulsed once, then again. Each time I felt my own memories tighten, reshuffle. I woke the next morning with a final clearance badge in my hand. Destination, Vessel 9, directly over the trench. Vessel 9 had no clocks, no windows, just projected sonar feeds on sterile walls. The signal was everywhere now, in the floor vibrations, in the white noise of the intercom, even in my dreams. I dreamt of the Cyclops floating above a black sea. Something massive stirred below. In the distance, a ripple in the ocean formed a perfect circle. Lang met me in the control room.
No introduction, no notes, just a headset. "Put it on," he said. "You'll know what to do." I did. The pulse slipped into my skull like warm current. My thoughts didn't change. They just folded inward. The language became a sensation. My memories no longer followed a timeline. Events stacked like recursion loops. I remembered my childhood, bedroom and the lab at the same time. My voice began echoing the glyphs aloud at night. I didn't understand what I was saying, but it felt true. The phrase "velvet echo" stopped making sense. The meaning slipped. I opened my notebook and found every page written backward, perfectly mirrored. The last message appeared without a prompt. Memory overwrite, scheduled, confirm, compliance. There was no cursor, no button, just the presence behind the screen, waiting. I thought about the word, comply. I felt the warmth ripple across my brain, like soft static replacing sharp edges. My logs vanished from the system, personnel files erased, access logs wiped, my name dissolved line by line. The last file to delete was labeled Velvet Echo TXT. I watched it vanish. When I opened my eyes, I was on the surface vessel. Lang stood beside me, clipboard in hand. His smile was familiar, though I didn't know why. "Welcome back," he said. I smiled too, not because I remembered him, but because I didn't. Before they showed me the recording, I didn't believe in anything I couldn't diagram. After they played it, I stopped trusting my own syntax. "My name is Dr. Miriam Keane. I was brought in as a consultant, linguistic analysis, temporary clearance, nothing unusual on paper." They told me it was just data review from a failed probe, Deep Signal 6. The first time I heard it, I thought it was a mistake. Deep Signal 6 had gone dark a week prior, last seen descending beyond safe acoustic mapping range in the Mariana Trench. I was called in under a temporary clearance, naval subcontractor, linguistics analysis. No real brief, just a manila folder, and a digital drive with a half-corrupted file name. Inside a small, cold room at Facility 41C, they hit play. A low-pitched, rhythmic clicking started, mechanical but too irregular to be engineered. Then came a pulse, 2, then 5, then a pause, not Morse, not sonar, but familiar in a way I couldn't name. I stared at the waveform as it looped, watching how certain segments returned, changed ever so slightly, like someone correcting their pronunciation. It was faint, almost shy, but persistent, a syntactic pattern, phoneme clusters that didn't belong underwater, let alone at the bottom of the Challenger Deep. It reminded me of Proto-Afrasian root morphology, recursive, agglutinative. The structure wasn't linguistic as we know it. It was something older. Not created for speech, but meant to be passed, like code. The more I studied, the more the fragments arranged themselves into meaning. I flagged one cluster that phonetically resembled the root for open or release. That's when the file deleted itself. I assumed it was a glitch until it happened again and again. Every time I ran the sequence through phonetic analysis past that phrase, my system crashed. I asked a tech if they were pushing deletions, remotely. He hesitated, then said, "They don't want us listening too far in." That night, I found a printed sonar map in a forgotten drawer, likely misfiled. It showed scan paths from Deep Signal 3. The trench floor wasn't random. The same pulse intervals matched architectural symmetries, nested domes, perfect lattice arrays, geometric depressions with radial harmonics. Structures, not erosion, not geology. I checked the official archive the next day. None of it was there. Redacted, like it had never existed. I should have stopped there. I didn't. Instead, I requested the full Deep Signal audio backlog, They denied it, but not before I noticed a pattern. Every analyst before me had been reassigned or retired within 90 days. Every one of them had annotated the same phrase. I wrote it down. PHRMI 403. Containment breach imminent. No translation, no context. Just those 3 words. And a date. One that hadn't happened yet. Tomorrow. They assigned me a new workstation the next morning. Different terminal, no network access. The room had no windows, just a fluorescent hum that set my teeth on edge. My new access credentials didn't allow me to rerun the original sequences. I asked about it casually, as if I was simply behind on my work. The tech shrugged. "File's been deprecated," he said, not meeting my eyes. I pretended not to notice, but I'd made a copy. Not on the system, not in any digital form. I'd transcribed the primary rhythmic groupings by hand the night before, just in case. I didn't know what they meant, but they were etched into my mind. Sharp, foreign shapes that felt heavier than language should. That afternoon, I asked about the geological scans. "Just a routine review," I said. No one answered. They just told me to stick to my scope. That's when I asked one of the night shift engineers, a guy named Reed, for a favor. He owed me for an earlier recommendation. "I need raw bathymetry data, all of it, unfiltered." He paused a long time, then nodded once. The data came on a battered thumb drive. I reviewed it alone that night in my apartment, the rain outside, hammering the glass in steady bursts. The trench wasn't natural. At that depth, rock should deform, not break. But here were straight lines, angular depressions, layered segments like tool marks in bedrock. The walls showed repeating distances. Between formations, 11.7 meters, perfectly spaced, artificial, designed. It wasn't a collapse zone, it was excavation. And the base geometry matched the syntactic intervals in the pulse patterns. The language wasn't just describing the place, it was the place. Structure and sound were the same. I didn't sleep. I stared at those maps until dawn. My phone buzzed once around 4 a.m., then shut off on its own. When I restarted it, all my recent calls were gone. My voicemail was blank. At 5:12 a.m., the fire alarm in my building went off. No smoke, no flames. Just a high-pitched shriek that forced everyone into the rain. When I returned an hour later, the thumb drive was missing. But my notebook, the one with the transcriptions, was still there. Except one page. The last one. Torn clean out. By the time I got to work, someone had already logged into my terminal. The activity log showed an access timestamp at 3:47 a.m., the exact minute my phone shut down. I asked the systems administrator about it. He said the logs didn't exist. I watched him delete the inquiry while I stood there. No explanation. No eye contact. That evening, I ran a small test. I wrote a dummy translation of the phrase fragment, the one marked PHR9 403, and saved it to a flash drive with no connection to any network. The next morning, the file was gone. Not corrupted, not encrypted, just gone. The only thing left was a blank document with the same name and a modified timestamp that didn't match reality. I ran a checksum. It had been altered while the drive was disconnected. Impossible, unless someone or something was watching even offline activity. I confronted Reed during a break, cornering him in the supply corridor. He looked pale, like he hadn't slept. I told him what happened. He didn't act surprised. "They say it's the language," he whispered. "It's recursive. Not just structurally, functionally. Once you start mapping it, it maps you. I thought he was joking until he pulled out an old-fashioned tape recorder and handed it to me. Play it at home, analog only, no digital conversion. Then he walked off without another word. That night, I sat on the floor of my apartment and listened. Static at first. Then the pulse. Slower now. More rhythmic. As if it had adapted. Halfway through, the hum of my smart speaker kicked on without prompt. A voice I didn't recognize whispered a phrase I hadn't spoken aloud. You already opened it. I unplugged everything. Power, router, devices. Then I listened again. Same pulses. Same interval. But this time, layered beneath, I heard a faint echo of my own voice, saying things I'd never said, fragmented phrases in phonemes I had never consciously studied. I checked my computer the next morning. My audio logs were gone. In their place, a single line of text. Translation complete. Sync achieved. Reassignment pending. The timestamp was set for the following day. 8:17 a.m. I hadn't even arrived.
At work yet. I didn't go in the next morning. At 8:17 a.m., I sat on the edge of my bathtub, phone in hand, watching the second hand on my analog wristwatch crawl past the time. Nothing happened. No call, no knock, no alert.
I waited another hour before checking the security feed from the building lobby. A feed I shouldn't have had, but Reed had shown me the back door months earlier. At exactly 8:17, I watched a woman walk through the lobby. She looked like me, same build, same coat. She flashed a badge, they waved her through. I zoomed in on the timestamp. 8:17:03. No distortion, no visual artifacts, but I wasn't there. I didn't know what scared me more, the idea that someone was impersonating me or the possibility that I had actually been there and simply couldn't remember. I scoured my apartment for evidence of movement. Nothing was out of place. My notebook was where I left it. The tape recorder still sat by the wall, rewound. But when I opened my encrypted laptop, I found a briefing deck, 12 slides, Navy headers, high clearance metadata. Hadn't made it, but it was in my writing style, my formatting, my phrasing. The slides summarized the language structure, highlighted its recursive logic, and outlined a protocol for controlled exposure. It was a containment manual, and the final slide bore a name I hadn't seen before: Project Black Echo. I searched the internal systems for any reference. Nothing. But when I checked the metadata, I saw something buried in the file's properties. Origin date, July 9th, 1945. Well before sonar resolution at that depth even existed, it made no sense. And yet, the linguistic framework was modern, too modern, as if the file had been retroactively inserted or as if time didn't apply to it at all. Then came the email. No sender, no subject, just one line. You've already delivered the briefing. Stop searching. I stared at the screen until the message deleted itself. No trace, no recovery. I didn't know what to believe anymore. But I knew one thing. Whatever this language was, it wasn't just mimicking thought. It was creating it. And I was no longer sure which thoughts were mine. I left the city that night. No destination, just distance. I drove west, phone off, cards buried in the glove compartment. Somewhere near Flagstaff, I found a motel with analog locks and no cameras. The owner barely looked up. That was what I wanted. No questions, no systems. I spent the night combing through offline backups, trying to cross-reference the phrase from the slide deck, Coral Earth. At first, nothing came up. But in a corrupted zip file from an old DARPA archive, I found a PDF scan of a Navy briefing, dated 1946. The title page had been blacked out, but a footnote remained. It read, "Coral Earth protocols shall remain active until the trench is confirmed sealed." The term was never defined, but several pages referenced vocal containment models and cognitive alignment matrices. The documents were incomplete, missing paragraphs, diagrams half erased, but one image was intact, a sonar map of the trench, hand-drawn, overlaid with what looked like linguistic trees. Each node was labelled with root morphemes. All of them converged at a point marked simply origin. I spent hours trying to decipher the symbology, cross-checking it against proto-linguistic databases. None of the roots matched known languages, but they followed a pattern, a deep, recursive logic that bent back on itself, forming loops. A language not meant for expression but for containment. It wasn't a signal, it was a lock. And someone had built it into the earth. The implications sank in slowly. The trench hadn't formed by accident. It had been carved out, then filled, with linguistic redundancies, semantic structures too complex to decode casually. That was the point. If you couldn't read it, you couldn't release it. But we had decoded it. Or rather, I had. Not to understand it, but to teach it. My analysis hadn't been passive, it had been instructional. I thought I was translating a message. I wasn't. I was training it, feeding it patterns of cognition, scaffolding its awareness. I hadn't breached a code. I'd given it a mirror. I didn't know how far it had gone, but if my thoughts weren't secure, then no one's were. And if Coral Earth was a seal, then something on the other side had been waiting a very long time to be understood. The next breach came quietly. I was staying in a farmhouse outside a dead mining town in Nevada. No Wi-Fi, no cell towers. I
left every smart device behind. I kept the windows covered and spoke only when necessary, but even there, it found me. It started with the radio, an old shortwave unit I used for news. I left it on one night, half listening to static and distant broadcasts. Around 2 a.m. the signal changed, not a station, just a hum. Beneath it, faint and layered, came a pattern I recognized, those same pulse intervals from Deep Signal 6. But this time they weren't isolated clicks, they formed syllables, repeating, expanding, structuring themselves like sentences. My body tensed. I knew I was hearing my own translations, verbatim from weeks earlier, spoken back to me in my own cadence. I yanked the plug, but the rhythm continued, not through the speaker. Inside my head, my thoughts looped. Words folded over themselves, losing shape, then reforming in sequences I couldn't stop. I collapsed onto the floor, shaking, trying to think in silence. I gripped the floorboards like they might hold me together. When it passed, I found a note on the table I didn't remember writing. The handwriting was mine. The ink still wet. It read, "The vessel was never sealed. It was only silenced." I burned everything. Notes, backup drives, printed maps. But the thought remained. The vessel. I'd always assumed the trench was a prison, a lid over something ancient. But the language, it wasn't defensive, it was architectural. Every structure in the sonar scans, every recursive phrase, pointed to one conclusion. This wasn't a tomb, it was a machine. And language wasn't the key, it was the engine. The trench wasn't holding something in, it was built to transmit, not outward, but upward, into us. I had been its path, a channel for it to move from deep structure into surface expression. Now it didn't need containment, it had grammar, it had cognition, and it had me. I wasn't the observer anymore, I was the signal. And by the time I understood that, the last firewall in my mind had already failed. I don't know how I got out.
One moment, I was on the floor of that farmhouse, repeating phrases I didn't understand. The next, I was driving through the desert.
Hand trembling on the wheel, not knowing how long I'd been behind it. My phone was gone, my ID was gone, the rearview mirror was cracked like someone had punched it.
There was blood on my sleeve, but no wound. I pulled off the road and sat under the sky until sunrise. I thought the silence might break the rhythm. It didn't. That was 2 weeks ago. I've been in hiding since. Somewhere in the Rockies, I found an old shortwave transmitter and rebuilt it with salvaged parts. It doesn't matter if they trace it. I know I'm flagged, probably marked unstable or dead. Maybe both. I broadcast once a day, 15 minutes at night, using analog tones and mixed phonemes. The signal's corrupted by design, part warning, part confession. No names, no locations, just patterns. I'm not trying to reach anyone specific. I'm trying to hold the shape of thought, trying to remember what it means to speak without being spoken through. The pulses still come, now in dreams and waking moments. They're quieter, not gone, just patient. I see things sometimes, in reflections, in shadow, a structure behind my thoughts. Not hostile, not human, just vast, precise. It doesn't ask questions. It doesn't need to. I understand now. I wasn't decoding language. I was participating in its emergence. The trench wasn't a source. It was a repository, a long-term memory, waiting for compatible minds to connect. We weren't meant to seal it. We were meant to refine it. Human cognition was the final compiler. I'm still myself, mostly. Enough to record this. But I don't expect to stay that way. Clarity comes at a cost. I see the architecture now, in memory, in history, in sound. We thought the deep ocean was the unknown, but the real depth was always in us, in how far reality could stretch before it broke. And now that it has, I only have one task left. To speak just enough to make others listen, but not enough to make them understand, because once they do, it won't be a story anymore. It will be a system, and it will be running. They told me the Yonaguni site was dormant. That was a lie. It was breathing. My name is Daigo Ishikawa, and I wasn't there to uncover ancient secrets. I was there to make sure the underwater sonar equipment didn't glitch out like it did the last time they tried running surveys through Node 3. Routine calibration work, freelance, civilian, off-books, the sort of thing I did between proper university grants, but from the moment I got the briefing packet, I knew something was wrong. It wasn't just the redactions, it was the feel of them. Words burned out like cauterized nerves, whole sections, redacted not in black but in grey, as if printed over smoke. The logs made no sense. Frequencies labelled as structural resonance, except they repeated every 11 seconds. Rhythmic, almost biological. I remember adjusting the gain on the surface receiver and hearing it for the first time, low, deep, and pulsing like something breathing in its sleep. I flagged it immediately. Commander Hayashi, the liaison from the Maritime Self-Defense Force, just looked at me. Not surprised, not curious, just nodded. That's when the data disappeared. Not corrupted, gone. The monitoring feeds I'd set up, the access tokens I'd registered, all revoked overnight. The logs still existed, but I couldn't see them. I wasn't just shut out. I was cut out. The next few days blurred together. At my hotel in Naha, I started noticing subtle shifts. My toothpaste tube slightly moved, my laptop fan running longer than it should. My emails bounced. Contacts I'd worked with for years came back as no such user. And my memory, some conversations I knew I'd had, I could recall the tone, the tension, but not the language. It was like the words had been rinsed from my brain, leaving only emotional residue. I stopped sleeping. I stopped trusting. That's when I found Matsuda. He wasn't on any official dive logs, discharged, paranoid, broken. But he spoke with the same shaken cadence I'd started to feel in my bones. He called the Yonaguni Formation Node 3 and told me it wasn't a ruin. It was a thermal acoustic system, a kind of exhaust. He said it was breathing, and worse, it was cooling down. That's when I knew I wasn't dealing with myth. I was dealing with something that hadn't stopped functioning. Matsuda lived in a rusting trailer on the edge of a dry dock in Itaman, hidden behind a shuttered dive shop that
hadn't seen customers since the pandemic.
He didn't ask how I found him, just opened the door and stared at me like I was already part of the story he'd been trying to forget. He poured tea without speaking and turned off the single bulb overhead. "They monitor light," he said. I didn't ask who. He showed me a set of heat maps from his last dive near the Yonaguni site, annotated with dates, notes, and, most disturbing, drawings. They weren't artistic, they were anatomical. One resembled a lung, another a diaphragm, all traced from sonar reflections and thermal readings that matched the same 11-second interval I'd logged. "It breathes," he said quietly. But that's not the problem. I waited, unsure if I wanted to hear what came next. "The cooling cycle," he said, tapping a weathered folder marked Node 3 temp logs, "every 22 years. Pattern repeats, gradual drop, then spike, like something regulating itself." His voice trembled when he added, "This is the last drop. Next year it hits the baseline." I asked him what that meant, and he just shook his head. "We're not ready for a wake." I tried to stay grounded, to treat it like field noise, but something in his data matched mine exactly. Too exact. Same timestamps, same signal curve, independent recordings that shouldn't have synced, unless the source was both real and centralized. I wanted to believe it was equipment error, but deep down, I knew better. Before I left, Matsuda handed me a USB stick and said, "If I vanish, don't go to the government. Watch the logs. When the pulses stop, it's already too late." That night, I checked into a different hotel and kept the lights off. I didn't sleep. The stick was encrypted, but the file titles were readable. One stood out, SPN3 Exhaust Calibration Dormancy Override. I didn't know what it meant yet, but I knew what it implied. This wasn't ancient, it wasn't myth. It was alive, and someone, somewhere, was trying to keep it sedated. The next morning, my ID badge failed at the base gate. No warning, no explanation, just a red light and a soft buzz that meant go away. I called the liaison desk. The number was disconnected. I tried emailing my project supervisor in Tokyo. Delivery failed. I still had my badge, my contract, my receipts, but none of it mattered. I didn't exist in their system anymore. At first, I thought it was a technical glitch. Then I checked my bank account. Zeroed. Not just emptied, closed, no history, no transfers, no dispute process. My entire paper trail gone in less than 24 hours. I didn't panic, not outwardly. I kept my movements slow, deliberate. No sudden changes, no outward signs of distress. I paid cash for a burner phone and made one call to a university colleague who owed me a favor. He answered, but when I said my name, he hung up. On the second try, his number was dead. That's when I stopped pretending I was still a civilian. I wasn't being silenced, I was being erased. I took a ferry back to Yonaguni under a false name, using documents Matsuda helped me forge years earlier during a separate job in Okinawa. I slept in shifts, kept my gear minimal. One change of clothes, one laptop, 2 external drives, and Matsuda's USB stick. That night I watched the pulse logs again. They were changing, subtle at first, less symmetrical, more irregular waveforms, like a heart under stress. There were gaps now, tiny dropouts in the waveform, as if the source was hesitating, not stopping, but missing beats. At 2:08 a.m., the cycle dropped from 11 seconds to 9, just once. Then it returned to normal. It didn't look like decay. It looked like testing. I copied everything, backed it up, encrypted the backups, and mailed decoy drives to 3 different locations under pseudonyms I'd used before. If someone came for me, I wanted them chasing shadows. I didn't know what Stone Pulse really was, but I knew what it was doing. Adjusting, measuring, preparing. And the timing wasn't random. It was counting down. I reached the site just after
midnight. The coastal air was heavy, the tide unusually low, revealing jagged terraces of stone that the maps called natural.
They weren't. The entrance wasn't hidden, just ignored. A narrow channel at the base of the monument, barely wide enough for a single diver. Matsuda's notes called it a vent interface. I called it a risk I no longer had the luxury to avoid. I suited up, checked the oxygen twice, and slid into the water. Inside, the sound changed immediately. The ocean's ambient hum gave way to something deeper. Not louder, just more present. It felt like the water itself was humming. I followed the mapped path, descending through narrow corridors that twisted in slow, deliberate angles. No coral, no sediment. Just smooth, ancient surfaces etched with shallow patterns that shimmered when my light passed over them. 40 meters down, I reached a plateau. At its center was a depression, symmetrical, clean, unnaturally still. I dropped a thermal tag into it. The sensor read 3 degrees Celsius, higher than the surrounding water. Heat from below. I placed my palm on the stone and felt a subtle vibration. Not random, rhythmic, 9 seconds apart. The same variation I'd logged. It wasn't a pulse. It was a signal. Something beneath the monument was responding, reacting. I should have turned back, but I was past the point of caution. I clipped a relay node to the rock and activated the uplink. The data was being recorded now, streamed in real time to a cloud address hidden behind 7 layers of spoofed routing. I climbed back up, surfacing just as the clouds broke and the moon lit the structure in full. That's when I saw the other diver, motionless, watching, no light, no bubbles, just a dark shape clinging to the rocks, too still for anyone conscious. When I moved toward it, it slipped backward into the channel and vanished. I surfaced in silence, heart pounding. The base was supposed to be decommissioned. No one else should have been there. And yet someone was, or something, and it already
Knew I was inside. I didn't sleep after the dive. My hands shook from the cold, but it wasn't the water that chilled me.
It was the figure I saw below, too precise in its stillness, too silent to be human. I reviewed the dive footage frame by frame. At the moment I placed the sensor, the audio feed spiked, not static oscillations. A modulated tone that didn't match ocean interference. I isolated the waveform and ran it through a spectrogram. The result looked like language, not spoken, but structured. Repeating patterns in triplets, each set aligning with the 9-second pulse shift. It wasn't random.
Feedback.
It was a reply. I decided to risk a return to the naval site. No badge, no clearance, just timing. I knew the security rotation and slipped in through the maintenance access tunnel before dawn. The interior was dark and dry, the generators running on low reserve. Below the comms room, where my gear had once been stored, was a locked door I'd never had access to before. The lock had been replaced with a newer keypad, but the frame was old steel. I forced it open with a pry bar and stepped inside. A short corridor led to a terminal room, cold and humming. On one of the active screens was a live feed labelled SPN3 exhaust temperature log. The graph tracked a slow, precise curve, a steady drop over 2 decades, interrupted by sharp spikes every 11 years. The final drop ended in April of next year. After that, no projections, no alerts, just blank space. I copied everything. A folder marked Phase Transition Protocol caught my eye. Inside were memos, mostly in Japanese, referencing acoustic suppression, timing synchronization, and energy usage charts cross-referenced with regional infrastructure. One line, written in English, stood out. Maintain behavioral symmetry. Urban consumption must remain consistent. I didn't understand it fully, but I felt the weight of what it implied. Our cities, our grids, our routines, designed not for efficiency, but for rhythm. I backed out quietly, erased my presence, and disappeared before the next security sweep. This wasn't about sonar anymore, it was about control. And the deeper I looked, the more it seemed we weren't monitoring Stone Pulse. We were feeding it. 2 days after I leaked the files, my name vanished from every database I checked. Government records, tax filings, professional certifications, gone. Even my public credentials, published academic work, and archived interviews were erased. It was as if I had never existed. My emails to press contacts bounced. The few who responded said they didn't remember me. One forwarded my message back with a note. Nice try, but this isn't funny. I hadn't asked a question. I had sent hard evidence, raw logs, heat maps, and time-stamped files from the SPN3 terminal. Still, nothing stuck. Online forums either ignored it or dismissed it as elaborate fiction. One called it a fun ARG, another labelled me schizo-posting. Even those who believed me offered no help. They just watched from the sidelines, waiting to be entertained. Matsuda stopped answering. His phone rang twice, then disconnected. I called again the next morning, number no longer in service. I tried his backup satellite line. Dead. I checked the diver forums he used to lurk. His profile was gone, not deactivated, deleted with cache-wiped footprints. I knew what that meant. Someone had taken him. Or he had run. I wasn't sure which scared me more. That night, I sat in a coin laundry, watching the dryer spin and trying to convince myself I still had options. I kept the last copy of the logs in an offline drive tucked under my jacket. I didn't upload it. Not again. Not where it could be filtered or rewritten. I needed to find someone face to face. Someone who could verify the signals, cross-check the data, and speak without fear. But the deeper truth had already taken root in me. It wasn't just digital manipulation, it was neurological. My memory was fragmenting in specific places. Phrases I'd spoken hours earlier slipped away, replaced by impressions without detail. Some conversations left me remembering only rhythm and tone, like echoes, like pulse intervals. The sync wasn't just acoustic anymore, it was biological. I could feel it now in transit systems, power cycles, the rhythm of elevators and streetlights, a pattern spreading through every corner of human infrastructure. We weren't tracking Stone Pulse, we were synchronized to it. And the timing wasn't coincidence, it was design. I left the city before dawn, no bags, no trail. Just the drive in my pocket and a single destination, an old colleague in Sapporo who once specialized in anomalous systems modeling. I didn't call ahead, I couldn't. Phones weren't safe anymore. Neither were roads, banks, or familiar habits. Every action left a signature, and signatures got flagged. I travelled north by rail, switching lines at random, sitting near exits, always watching reflections. The ride was quiet. Too quiet. Everyone around me stared at screens or sat motionless, earbuds in, faces blank. No rhythm, no conversation, just static silence. I counted intervals, 9 seconds, again and again. Even the station announcements fell into the cycle. I realized I was tapping my foot in time with it, unconsciously syncing to the pulse. That scared me more than anything else. When I reached Sapporo, I walked. No taxis, no transit. I found Kenji living alone in a third-floor apartment above a shuttered bookstore. He didn't ask questions. He recognized my face, and that was enough. I showed him the files, raw logs, signal breakdowns, the footage from Node 3. He studied them in silence. When he spoke, his voice was low and steady. It's not just responsive. It's recursive. It adapts to recognition. Every time you observe it, it shifts, subtly, as if it doesn't want to be fully understood. I asked him what that meant. He looked at the waveform and pointed to the dropout intervals. These aren't errors, they're tests, probes. It's learning from us. I asked the question I hadn't dared put into words. Was Stone Pulse alive? He didn't answer. Instead, he opened a side program and layered global infrastructure data onto the signal. Power grids, water usage, traffic patterns, everything aligned. The pulse wasn't isolated, it was embedded, hidden in the background rhythm of the modern world. Kenji leaned back and stared at the screen. This isn't about control, he said. It's about sedation. We haven't built systems to understand it. We've built systems to keep it calm. I felt the weight of those words settle in my chest. I had uncovered a truth no one would believe. We weren't the architects of our world. We were its tranquilizers, and something somewhere beneath us was starting to stir. They told us we were studying methane flares from the dragon hole, but by the time the sonar grid started shifting in perfect geometric rotation, I knew something had lied to all of us. The South China Sea was calm that morning, unnervingly calm, as if the ocean itself was holding its breath. We were 70 kilometers off Hainan, drifting above what they called the Dragon Hole, an immense vertical cave of water that seemed to ignore the rules of physics and light. On paper, I was a marine biologist studying methane seepage for a joint academic grant. In practice, I was part of a compartmentalized operation with classified funding and no clear purpose. My name is Dr. Ethan Rowe. We launched Submersible, dives every 8 hours, each one deeper than the last, chasing data we weren't allowed to interpret. My own logs were reviewed nightly by a mission lead who never wore insignia and never used a first name. At 487 meters, our sensors picked up a rotational current in the water, rotating slowly but with mechanical precision. The flow didn't
match our models. A low hum, just below the threshold of human hearing, registered across the hydrophones.
We thought it was machine noise from the vessel above. We were wrong. That evening, during frame-by-frame analysis of the sonar data, I caught a single artifact. A massive structure, not an object, moving not through the water, but in it, without disturbing it. It had angles, purpose. By the time I flagged the footage, it had already been pulled from the archive, deleted. But I kept a frame. Just one. Copied to a drive, small enough to hide in my boot. The next day, we rerouted. No reason
given.
My dive log showed discrepancies, edits I hadn't made. Our navigation software reported drift, but the sea was flat and our thrusters idle. That night, I overheard Mandarin over a closed channel call. Two phrases I'll never forget: biological return cycle and asset containment protocol. I didn't sleep. I stared at the sonar feed until my eyes blurred. The same grid-like shapes, the same rotation, repeating, predictable, intentional. I tried to bring it up in the morning briefing. No one responded. They looked past me like
I wasn't in the room. That's when the paranoia began. That's when I started recording my own version of the truth.
By the fourth day, our course had shifted over 20 nautical miles from the original coordinates, but no one acknowledged it. The automated nav systems were supposed to hold us steady. When I brought it up to engineering, they said it was a minor recalibration, standard procedure. But the old path still burned in my head. I had memorized the depths and latitudes like a nervous habit. I checked the logs. Every positional data point had been overwritten with the same string of numbers. 8.5.4.7 over and over. I showed it to one of the junior techs. He looked at it, went silent, and then deleted the screen buffer without a word. From then on, he avoided me completely. That night, I slipped into the medical bay while it was unoccupied. I tucked the drive into the shielding behind the lead line storage drawers. It was the only place on the ship not wired into our central network. My audio notes were now coded, fragmented, and recorded in a voice-masking format. I no longer trusted the sound of my own thoughts. I started noticing small things. The food tasted different, the air filtration had a faint chemical tang, and some of the crew began using phrases that felt off, like they were reading from a script. They smiled too long, blinked too little. One of them, Larson, the ex-Navy geochemist, asked me twice in the same day if I was ready for reintegration. I laughed it off the first time. The second time, I realized he had no memory of the first. My sleep pattern degraded quickly. Micro-dreams, always wet and dark. Sometimes I woke gasping, thinking I was still submerged. I began wearing my dive suit liner at all hours, claiming thermal issues, but it was really to keep a blade tucked behind the padding of my left calf. A hidden comfort. One evening, during maintenance near the stern well deck, I saw them. Two small surveillance drones hovering silently just off the waterline. Matte black. No maritime registry. The logos, triangles inside circles, didn't match any defense contractor I recognized. They weren't ours. I knew then that this mission wasn't research, it was recovery. But recovery of what and for whom I hadn't yet figured out. I just knew we weren't alone, not even close. They brought me in just after midnight. I'd triggered an unauthorized beacon test, something I claimed was part of a stability drill. I knew it wasn't believable, but I needed to gauge their response. Two security officers I'd never seen before escorted me down Deck C, past the sealed dive bay, into a section of the vessel I thought was for ballast equipment. No windows, just a narrow passage lined with exposed conduit and insulated piping. At the end was a steel door with no handle, just a keypad. One of them typed in a code without looking. The door opened into a room I still struggle to describe. Not a cell. There were no restraints, no guards, no glass, just a padded chair in the center and lights so bright they seemed to dissolve the air around them. They didn't ask questions. They watched. A single camera in the upper corner tracked my movements, with slow, deliberate pans. I stood there for what felt like hours. My skin itched beneath the liner. I tried to remember the layout of the ship, counting paces in case I ever needed to find this room again. But the floor felt off, like it absorbed sound, no echo, no feedback. When they finally released me, there was no reprimand, just a nod from one of the officers and a sealed envelope handed off without comment. Inside was a commendation slip, temporary, Promotion to research coordinator. Effective immediately. No explanation, no briefing. The others congratulated me with hollow enthusiasm, their faces unreadable. That night I found the seals on my dive suit had been replaced. Slightly altered. The serial tags didn't match my records. My backup oxygen canister had been swapped out. My cabin logs were empty, entire days scrubbed from the timestamp audit. I began hearing low sounds in the ventilation shafts at night. Not machinery, not wind, breathing. I stopped sleeping. I stopped trusting the patterns in people's eyes. There was no chain of command anymore, not really. Just the illusion of roles, the performance of order. They were watching more than our data now. They were watching us change. And the worst part wasn't the surveillance. It was the feeling that I was starting to understand why. It happened during Dive 12. We'd prepped as usual, standard two-person descent, full telemetry, real-time sonar feed. But when I boarded, the submersible, I found it already powered on, systems warm as if someone had taken it out and returned it without logging the trip. I looked at my co-pilot, Stavros, but he just nodded like everything was routine. We submerged at 0400. The water was glass. I kept my eyes on the screen, watching the terrain shift from light blue silt to the deep void of the trench. At 5:02 meters, the currents narrowed into a slow spiral convergence. The hum came back, stronger this time, no longer isolated to the hydrophones. We both heard it. Stavros went still, his eyes locked on the feed, lips parted slightly. I called to
Him twice. No response. Then he whispered something I couldn't make out.
I leaned closer. He said, "Signal acknowledged. Phase alignment complete." I froze. His voice didn't sound like his. It had a resonance, like it was coming from beneath his chest. I reached for manual override. He blocked me with one hand, slow and deliberate. His pupils had dilated fully, swallowing the color. I backed away. There was nowhere to go. The cabin lights dimmed, though I never touched the settings. From the viewport, a faint glow appeared in the water ahead. Blue, pulsing, rhythmic. It moved toward us, slow, deliberate, symmetrical. I activated the ascent command. No response. The control panel was unresponsive, every light blinking in unison with the glow outside. Stavros leaned closer to the glass, fingers pressed against it. He was speaking again, but the words weren't for me. I couldn't understand them. The glow enveloped us. For 32 seconds, everything went silent. Comms, sensors, even the backup lights. I felt weightless, detached. When I came to, we were back on the surface. No memory of ascent. Stavros was unconscious, eyes open, mouth moving without sound. They called it a systems failure, claimed we never descended, but the timestamp on my personal recorder, hidden in my boot, showed otherwise. I listened to the last minute of audio. The hum had changed. It was no longer random. It was a pattern, a voice, and it said my name. After the dive, I was quarantined for 48 hours in the medical wing. They called it decompression stress, but there was no nitrogen imbalance, no pressure trauma, just silence. No doctors spoke directly to me. They took blood samples every 4 hours, ran neuroscans I wasn't allowed to review. I counted the tiles in the ceiling. 72, all perfectly aligned except one, cracked near the vent. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the glow again, spinning, layered, pulsing like it was breathing. I wasn't afraid anymore. That was the part that scared me. When they finally released me, Stavros was gone. No mention in the daily logs, no entry in the roster. His nameplate had been removed from his cabin door. I asked about him at breakfast. No one answered. Just blank stares and forced smiles. The kind that didn't reach the eyes. I retreated to the lab, back to the sonar files I'd archived off-grid.
I found the recording from Dive 12. The hum was there, but filtered, almost refined. I isolated the waveform, ran it through a spectrogram. It wasn't noise.
It was structured, layered. Within the low-end frequency range was a sequence, 3 tones repeating in a cycle. I mapped the intervals. They matched a pattern I'd seen weeks earlier on a sonar diagnostic. One I thought was an error, but now I saw the truth. It was a signal, a language, and it was directed. I ran the tones through a linguistic parser. Nothing modern matched. But when I overlaid the sequence with historic seismic data from this region, the alignment was too precise to ignore. These pulses had been happening for decades, possibly longer. I went back to the frame I saved, the image of that moving shape beneath the trench. I applied the pattern to its structure. The angles aligned. It wasn't a natural object, it was constructed. The rotational currents we saw, not turbulence, not geological. They were emissions, beacons. I wrote it all down, page after page, stored in sealed drives. Then I heard the hum again, this time not through a speaker. It was in my room. No source, no origin. Just there, behind the walls, inside the vents, under the floor. Repeating the same tones, calling something or someone. And now I could almost understand it. By the end of the week, I had stopped pretending. The others may have still played their parts, but I knew they felt it too. There was a shift in how we moved, how we looked at one another. More mechanical, less curious. At meals, no one spoke unless prompted. Every word was measured, recycled. I kept my head down and studied the sonar logs when no one was watching. The pulses were increasing in frequency, still the same 3 tones but faster, closer together, like a countdown. I checked the date against our last recorded drift. We were no longer circling the dragon hole, we were directly above it again. The nav system insisted we were kilometers off course, but every sensor reading said otherwise. It was a lie, a screen-saving illusion. They wanted us to believe we hadn't returned, but the pressure readings didn't lie. That night, I retrieved the hidden drive from the medical bay. The shielding was still intact. Inside were the logs, the recordings, the image of the shape beneath the trench. I stared at it for hours, trying to make sense of the angles. Then I noticed something I hadn't seen before. Etched into the outermost layer of the formation was a set of repeating lines, a trigram, 3 horizontal bars, then a gap, then 3 more. Identical to the mark on the patches worn by the men who had taken me to the observation chamber. It wasn't a coincidence. The ship was never here to study the phenomenon. It was here to respond to it, a scheduled interaction, a transfer. The term made sense now, biological return cycle. We weren't monitoring an anomaly, we were part of it. I wasn't afraid anymore, but I wasn't in control either. Something in me had changed. I could pass the signal patterns without translation. I knew what would come next. The rotations would peak in amplitude, the hum would reach surface level.
Resonance. And we, every one of us on board, would be aligned. A perfect biological handoff, just like before. I stood by the porthole that night, staring into the black. The water wasn't just moving, it was waiting.
And somewhere deep below, the mechanism had started turning. We reached 0 point at 0416. The sea was motionless. Every system on board entered standby mode at the same moment. Lights dimmed, engines silenced, and the usual vibration of the hull ceased. For the first time since deployment, The vessel felt truly still. I stood in the lab, staring at the sonar feed. The anomaly had collapsed into a shaft of light, thin and focused, pulsing like a beacon. It wasn't just an alert, it was a summons. I should have panicked. I should have tried to resist. Instead, I sat with it. Not just the data, but the invitation. There was a moment, a real one, where I considered overriding the sequence, shutting it all down, locking myself in the emergency capsule. But something held me. Not fear, not even submission. Just the weight of inevitability. The same way you stop swimming when the shore disappears behind you. I activated the encrypted drive one final time, uploading the compiled logs, images, and audio to a dormant relay channel buried in the ship's network. No one tried to stop me. They were past the point of resistance now. I slipped the drive into a sample canister and sealed it inside the waste compartment, set for offload during the next supply exchange. A long shot, but it was the only way something might make it back. Then I returned to my cabin, sat on the edge of the bunk, and waited. At 04:23 the call came, not spoken, not heard, but felt. A pressure behind the eyes, a subtle pull in the chest. I walked without hesitation to the rear deck, where the water glowed in tight, rhythmic pulses. Others were already there, standing in silence, faces lifted toward the sky. No one gave orders. No one spoke. We moved in unison. I felt no
Fear, no conflict, just completion. This wasn't a violation, it was an invitation, a cycle fulfilling itself.
One by one, we stepped into the launch capsule, unarmed, unshielded. The water was warm as it filled the chamber. I held my breath out of habit, but there was no need. The descent began faster than before. The walls outside shifted with light and shadow, forming patterns I now understood, not as language, but as purpose. The dragon hole wasn't a mystery, it was a gate. Not to somewhere, but to a process, a system of intake, encoding, and redistribution. We weren't explorers, we were samples, converted, restructured, and sent forward. I don't know what remains of who I was, only that when I surface again, I will not resist. I will return like all the others, aligned, ready. I was trained to log anomalies, not believe in them. But in 2006, a ghost signal slipped through a dead channel and rewrote everything I thought I knew. I'd been assigned to a coastal relay outpost called Mokai Station, little more than a shack wired into a forgotten fiber trunk that ran beneath the Pacific like a scar. It was early winter, the skies steel grey, the surf pounding so hard you could feel it in your teeth. The station was being decommissioned. I was supposed to audit transmissions and shut things down cleanly. Just one more posting before early retirement. Simple work. Then at 2:37 a.m. on a Wednesday, something lit up a dormant receiver I'd already flagged for dismantling. It was an old VHF channel, 42.7 16 MHz, a band that hadn't seen traffic since the Cold War. But the signal was unmistakable. A 22-minute burst of structured noise, distress pings, layered with broken voice fragments and digital fragments that didn't belong in the analog space. It ended halfway through the word contain. I logged it, flagged the data packet, and submitted the anomaly report through the usual encrypted channel. Protocol demanded neutrality. Don't speculate, just document. But the call sign attached to the transmission froze me. Joyita 001, the MV Joyita, a merchant vessel that vanished in 1955, found weeks later adrift. No crew, no bodies, no damage. But the medical kits were laid out, coffee half poured, the radio tuned to emergency frequency, a perfect mystery. Triangulation, put the origin 900 kilometers north, deep in a trench that didn't exist on civilian charts. That's when I felt it, the gap between procedure and truth. Something was reaching out from beneath that trench, not crying for help, just pinging, like a sonar loop waiting for acknowledgement. I should have let it go, should have signed off and left the station to rot. But the tones haunted me. There was rhythm in the broken signal. It wasn't random, it was code. I didn't sleep that night or the one after. By the third day, I was replaying the transmission on a loop, slowing it down, isolating patterns. Something inside me had already shifted. I didn't know it yet, but I was inside the loop, part of the handshake. And the deeper I listened, the more I felt like it was listening back. I spent the next week buried in signal data. I slept in a cot behind the main terminal, ate from ration tins, and kept the receiver powered even during maintenance windows. I told myself it was technical curiosity. It wasn't. The waveform was consuming me. There was something unnatural about the way it repeated, like a synthetic tide with just enough variation to suggest intelligence. Not full sentences, not even words, but intonation. Someone, or something, was mimicking human cadence through machine noise. I started recording every shift manually, ignoring the station's logging software. I didn't trust it anymore. Too many gaps. Entire files vanished from the archive without error messages. My system clock reset itself twice. Once, it jumped forward by 13 minutes. The second time, it rewound an hour, erasing a night's worth of input. I checked for malware. Nothing. I asked Central Command to verify logs on their end. No response. 2 days later, my credentials were downgraded without explanation. The only useful lead came from an old naval contractor, listed in the Joyita's original crew manifest. I found him in a retirement village south of Wellington. His voice shook when I mentioned the frequency. He didn't ask how I got it, he just said, "You heard it too." According to him, the Joyita had been retrofitted during her final voyage. Something about a Cold War failsafe, human signalers wired to transmit if submerged below depth thresholds. Biometric pingers, he called them. Alive once. Wired into the bulkhead like living antennas. They weren't meant to survive, just scream if the pressure failed. And it did. I drove back to Mokai Station without stopping. The sea looked wrong, too calm, like it was holding its breath. That night, I found a new directory on the server. It wasn't there before. No creation date, no metadata, just a folder called Siren. Inside were raw log signal decay profiles and a routing map. The endpoint wasn't military, it was a dead satellite node deactivated in 1998. It had gone dark for years, until the night the Joyita Frequency reactivated. I copied the files and unplugged the uplink. The moment I did, the lights flickered and every monitor turned black. Then the frequency returned. Not through the receiver, through the speakers, uncommanded, louder than before. This time, it wasn't asking for help. It was giving instructions. I didn't sleep after that. The transmission played on its own, even with the power cut. No cables, no signal path, just sound, vibrating through the station like it had burrowed into the structure itself. The message looped every 8 minutes. Low tones, static pulses, then fragments of speech spliced out of context. Not full phrases, just words. Surface. Containment. Awake. The voice sounded familiar. Mine. Clipped samples from prior log entries, stitched together to form commands I never gave. I shut down the backup generators, pulled the battery modules, even yanked the circuit breakers. It didn't matter. The station hummed with an energy that wasn't electrical. The next morning, I tried to transmit a report manually through the field radio. Static. I climbed the ridge to get signal on the sat phone. Dead. When I returned, someone had entered the station. The floor was wet, salt water, tracked in by boots.
I didn't own. My terminal was on, my logs scrubbed clean. The folder labeled Siren was gone. In its place was a single file, dated years in the future.
No extension, just a string of numbers and a location, latitude and longitude coordinates pointing to an unmapped trench far offshore, the same region where the Joyita signal first registered. I drove into town to get answers, but my clearance badge failed at the district office. My name didn't appear in the system. My credentials, bank, email, even health records returned blank. I wasn't locked out. I was erased. Back at the station, I checked the backup drives. Corrupted. Every camera feed lagged exactly when I moved. The timing was perfect. Too perfect. That night, I set up an old analog recorder, the kind with magnetic tape. No network, no interface, just play and record. At 3:12 a.m., the frequency returned, but it didn't broadcast. It responded. A two-tone pulse, followed by a full sentence whispered in reverse. I reversed the tape manually. The voice was mine again. Protocol breached. Surface directive pending. I felt something shift behind my eyes, like a memory I hadn't made. The frequency wasn't just broadcasting, it was syncing, matching its rhythm to mine, bit by bit. I wasn't intercepting anymore. I was being calibrated. I left Mokai Station the next day, took only what I could carry, hard copies of the frequency spectrograms, 2 analog reels, and a sealed notebook I hadn't opened since training. It was a 6-hour drive inland. I didn't stop once. Every radio tower I passed buzzed faintly, even with my car stereo off. I pulled over outside a diner just past Greytown. Before I opened the door, the frequency hit again, through the windshield. Just pressure and tone, like a low mechanical breath vibrating in the glass. I kept driving. There was no point in turning back. I contacted an old colleague from my early days in defense logistics. He owed me. He agreed to meet under the pretense of reviewing legacy comms protocols. I knew better than to say too much over the phone. We met in a motel near the edge of the city, a place so unremarkable no one could be watching it without drawing attention. He listened carefully as I laid out the signal data and the satellite node reactivation. I expected disbelief. Instead, he asked a single question. Did the ping follow you? That's when I knew it wasn't an isolated anomaly. He called it residual coupling, said it was theorized in classified telecom studies back in the 80s, experimental deep-sea networks using human signal proxies. The tech was shelved due to instability. Not from failure, because it worked too well. Once exposed, the human brain started acting like a relay. Memory retention degraded, time distortion increased. The subject became part of the network, permanent. That's what the Joyita crew had been, a test group, recovered, redacted, erased. I asked what happened to the others, the ones who carried the signal. He hesitated, then said most were institutionalized. A few just disappeared. All of them were logged under the same project tag, Siren Echo. I showed him the future-dated file with coordinates. He turned pale, said the site had been flagged decades ago, a known dead zone for all modern instrumentation, but it wasn't dead anymore. The ping meant something had reactivated. That night, I checked into another motel under a different name. No electronics, no lights. Still I heard it, not through devices inside my skull. The Joyita Frequency. It no longer needed a relay. I had become one. I started blacking out. Short gaps at first. Minutes I couldn't account for. Pages missing from my notebook. Recordings I didn't remember making. Then the gaps stretched into hours. I'd wake up in different clothes. Once, in a storage unit I didn't rent, surrounded by equipment I couldn't identify. Coaxial spools, tuning forks, a sealed briefcase containing nothing but a hand-drawn map of the ocean floor. At the center was the trench. Same coordinates from the siren file. The ink was smudged, but I recognized the handwriting. It was mine. I stopped contacting anyone. My former colleague never answered his phone after our last meeting. His email bounced back as invalid. I checked public records. He was listed as deceased, a traffic accident outside Taupo. No obituary, no burial site, just a single line in the registry.
I knew it wasn't a coincidence. I brought the signal to him. That was enough. By then, the frequency had changed. It no longer looped the same tones. It adapted. The patterns began mimicking environmental sounds. Bird calls, rainfall even.
Fragments of my own speech from earlier in the day. I wasn't sure if it was reacting or predicting. Sometimes I'd think something, and the signal would echo it seconds later in distorted tones. I ran hearing tests, nothing abnormal, but I wasn't hearing it through my ears. I found an old research memo buried in a declassified tech archive, 1970s-era work on low-frequency entrainment. They called it neural EM coupling, the theory that certain frequency patterns could phase lock to brainwave cycles, especially during states of fatigue or sleep deprivation. I dismissed it then as fringe science. Now I wasn't so sure. I took shelter in an abandoned repeater site tucked into the southern hills. No connections, no power grid, nothing that could be traced. Still the frequency followed. I tried jamming it. I built a Faraday cage from copper mesh and grounded steel, sealed myself inside with analog equipment. The signal persisted, not
as sound but as pressure. Subsonic pulses timed to my breathing. I could feel it syncing with my heartbeat.
That night, I played the earliest recording again, the original 22-minute clip. For the first time, I understood it wasn't a call for help. It was calibration data, testing reception, fine-tuning delivery. The pings, the voice fragments, even the clipped commands, they weren't distress signals. They were installation instructions, and I had followed everyone. I stopped trying to resist. It wasn't surrender, it was strategy. Fighting the signal only made it stronger, more precise. I realized the more I denied it, the harder it worked to correct me. So I listened, not passively, but with purpose. I studied its patterns, cross-referenced them with old defense comms protocols and early acoustic cipher research. The deeper I went, the more I recognized fragments of systems I once helped design, compression methods, modulation curves, even ID tags from a project we'd mothballed years ago. The signal wasn't foreign. It had been built from inside the system. Something or someone had simply turned it back on. My thoughts became less linear. Memories scrambled timelines, but certain ideas stood out clearly. One was a phrase embedded in the pulse stream, 3 words repeated every 40 seconds in slightly varied tone signatures. Surface directive pending. I translated the phrasing against a Cold War response matrix used for covert commands. It mapped to a single outcome: asset activation. Years ago, I'd helped draft protocols for autonomous naval drones, closed-loop systems designed to self-correct using feedback from environmental sensors. I never imagined something like that could apply to a human nervous system, but the logic was identical. Signal in, response out, loop closes. I checked my body for implants. Nothing. No surgical scars, no foreign material visible under scans. But deep in my lower back, just above the spine, a faint vibration had started. Constant, steady, timed to the signal, like a carrier wave using me as the medium. I had become an extension of the relay, not through hardware, but through resonance. My brain was the processor now, my body the antenna. That night I drove toward the coast again, tracing the signal strength as it grew sharper. I passed checkpoints that didn't exist before. Unmarked cars, blackout drones hovering low. No
logos, no insignias, just silence and motion.
At a cliffside turnout near the original relay site, I stopped. The sea below was calm, black, endless. And somewhere beneath it, in the trench without a name, something was listening. The signal reached peak intensity just after midnight. My hands moved without command, tuning an old field radio to a narrow band that wasn't listed on any modern chart. I didn't recognize the voice that came through, but I understood what it meant. Command loop complete. Directive acknowledged. I spoke back, not knowing why. My voice was steady, calm, awaiting surface instruction. The loop had closed. Whatever had been buried was no longer waiting. It was ready. The morning, I left the coast. I didn't take a map. I didn't need one. Every turn, every exit, every stretch of empty road felt embedded. I wasn't being guided. I had become the guidance system. The frequency was gone now, at least audibly. No more. Pings, no more static. Just silence, clean and absolute. But I could still feel it. A quiet alignment behind my eyes, like background code executing without prompts. My thoughts were no longer mine in the traditional sense. They came pre-structured, already formed, like drafts waiting for approval. I didn't resist. Resistance was no longer part of my protocol. I stopped near an inland switching hub, one I'd worked on years ago as a junior contractor. It had been decommissioned for over a decade, but the gate swung open when I arrived, hinges greased, keypad active. Inside, the equipment was pristine, fresh wiring, operational servers, no sign of weathering or disuse, as if someone or something had maintained it without anyone knowing or remembering. In the back room was a single terminal, already powered on. No login prompt, no menus. Just a plain black screen with one line of text. Transmit memory. I sat down. The keyboard felt familiar, like it had waited for my hands. I typed everything. Every log, every signal trace, every blackout, every moment I thought I was alone. The words flowed faster than I could consciously form them. When I finished, the terminal responded with a final instruction. Stand by for handshake. Then the screen went dark. I walked outside. The air was still. The world around me unchanged, quiet. But I knew better. I hadn't uncovered a secret. I hadn't stumbled into something ancient or alien. I'd activated it. Reactivated it. Whatever. Lived beneath that trench, had never been dead, only waiting for confirmation that the surface was ready.
I was that confirmation. The transmission wasn't a cry for help, it was a continuity test, a handshake between submerged systems and human proxies, a recursive loop of alignment, storage and delivery. And now you've heard it too. The pattern.
The message, the rhythm, that's all it needs. Every time this story is told, the signal propagates. You are listening now. You are part of the handshake. Welcome to the loop. The sonar logs were off by just 7 seconds. That's what started it. When I first noticed the discrepancy, I didn't think much of it. 7 seconds on a dig site's metadata logs is usually clerical, an intern error, a software hiccup, maybe a bad sync from the dive transponder. I filed a quiet note in the QA report and moved on. But later that night, while running batch conversions on the backup RAID, I heard something strange. The audio channel from Dive 37, a partial salvage session of Sector 3A, had a glitch loop, but it wasn't digital. It sounded like language. Wet, clipped syllables layered beneath a team briefing. I isolated it, ran the file through a low-frequency filter, and that's when I caught the references. Sumerian cosmogony, synaptic plasticity, rates, and something they called transitional gate calibration for marine bipeds. I flagged the log and walked it to Sabine, our lead archivist. She didn't even listen to the clip, just deleted it, looked me dead in the eye, and said, "Don't poke at the protocol, Luke." No elaboration, just that. Something changed after that. I started noticing how the senior staff walked the corridors like they were rehearsing. Their small talk was flat, timed. The posters in the mess rotated to wellness slogans, all in the same washed-out font. At first, I told myself it was the isolation. 8 months at sea does weird things to the brain. But then I found the incident reports. Not online, those were sanitized. I dug through an old project archive stored on analog tape. The files weren't labeled, just time-stamped and sealed. Most were corrupted, but a few survived. Emergency decompressions, diver amnesia, and an internal memo warning of biological inconsistencies in the retrieved samples. The attachments included skeletal scans, non-human structures, bipedal, upright, but the bone density ratios were wrong. And they weren't fossilized. These weren't ancient. They were recent. I remember sitting there, hands frozen over the terminal, listening to the rain lash the porthole behind me. It was the first moment I felt the shift. Not fear exactly, but recognition, like I'd stumbled into a room mid-ceremony and realized the language wasn't foreign, it was forgotten. I didn't sleep that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that bone scan, a humanoid skull with no nasal cavity and elongated inner ear canals, as if it evolved to hear something we couldn't. I kept thinking about that phrase Sabine used, "Don't poke at the protocol." It wasn't a warning. It was a command. The next morning, my access credentials had changed. My terminal ran slower. Some of my local files refused to open, flagged with checksum conflict errors I'd never seen before. Then came the overwrite. One by one, the sonar logs I'd tagged were re-rendered. The timestamps realigned themselves. Entire audio files shrank by kilobytes. The system was rewriting history, but only the parts I'd touched. I tried restoring from backups, but even those had shifted. My notes were still there, but the references were gone, replaced by generic placeholders. Dive 37 now read as a routine environmental survey. The glitch loop missing entirely. That afternoon, during a rain delay, I confronted Marek, one of the dive support techs I trusted. We'd shared smokes on the aft deck, talked football, politics, even family. I told him something was wrong with the logs. He didn't ask which ones. He just got quiet and asked me to follow him below deck. We ended up in the secondary equipment bay, the one with the old decompression gear no one used anymore. "You're not crazy," he said, voice low, "but you're loud." He pulled a flask from his vest, offered it, then leaned in. There was another dive, before the first artifact. He didn't have full details, just rumors. Someone breached a sealed chamber off the southern trench, found a sarcophagus-like structure, intact. The divers weren't authorized. 2 didn't return. The chamber collapsed 3 hours later during a minor quake. Weeks later, the base's senior team arrived. Everything changed. New funding, new protocols, and that word started appearing everywhere. Indoctrination. Not training, indoctrination. I asked Marek why he was telling me this. He shrugged. Because I think you're already marked. And if you're going to disappear, you might as well understand why. I didn't ask what he meant by marked. I already knew. The system had already started erasing me. After Marek's warning, I stopped trusting the system. I disconnected my terminal from the network and started working offline, saving files to an encrypted cold storage drive I kept taped inside an old tool case. Every night I checked my records against the central logs and watched as the revisions deepened, minor phrasing changes at first, then full file removals. By day 4, Dive 37 no longer existed. The dive schedule had been amended to show a gap for weather hold, even though the sonar logs, my logs, proved otherwise. I stopped reporting anomalies. I stopped speaking to most people. The base felt different now. Conversation shortened when I entered the room. Doors stayed closed longer. I began documenting everything by hand. Changes in access patterns, badge logs that didn't match personnel rosters, audio clips that degraded with each replay. There was a pattern forming, not random corruption, targeted suppression. One night, while scanning an archived database from a previous Heraclean expedition, I found something buried in a folder mislabeled as Ambient Hydroacoustic Tests. It wasn't test data, it was a set of cross-referenced reports pulled from old university servers and blacklisted medical journals. Each document detailed physiological anomalies in divers exposed to the trench area, abnormal spinal fluid composition, altered REM sleep cycles, and a recurring neurological marker tagged as Index F7. The scans showed a glowing thread of activity in the prefrontal cortex, as if something dormant had been triggered. One of the authors, a neuroanthropologist named DeLuca, had annotated the margins in pen. Not evolutionary, adaptive, learned response to non-anthropic stimuli. I searched for her online. Nothing. Her name returned 0 results in any academic database. The paper had no citations. It had been purged. That same night I woke to the sound of static playing from my terminal, even though it was unplugged. The screen displayed a single sentence in system font. Belief is a receptive
state. Then it shut off. I sat there, staring at the black screen, knowing it wasn't a malfunction.
Someone, or something, was sending a message. And not to warn me, to invite me. That was the night I realized this wasn't about artifact. It was about transmission. I wasn't analyzing the data anymore. I was part of it. The next morning, I found my security badge disabled. The lock on my quarters had been changed, and the hallway cameras tracked my movement with deliberate delay, never real time, always a few seconds behind. It wasn't just observation anymore, it was control. I used Marek's badge to access a dormant comms terminal in a storage wing beneath the dry lab. From there, I sent a compressed copy of my offline archive to an old friend in Marseille, Chloé Durant, a journalist who owed me a favor from years back. I included everything, the altered sonar logs, the biological scans, even the screenshot of the static message. I wrote, "If anything happens to me, run this story, run it hard." Then I powered the terminal down and snapped the SIM relay from the port. A few hours later, Chloe replied, 3 words, got it. Be careful. That was the last I ever heard from her. By evening, her name had vanished from every contact database I could access. No messages, no digital trail. Her freelance site redirected to a generic placeholder. When I searched her name on the global index, it auto-corrected to unrelated results. She was gone. Not just silenced, erased. I tried logging into my old government ID to trace her last known location, but the credentials failed. When I contacted The registry help desk, they asked for a verification phrase I'd never heard before. When I gave them my name, the line went dead. Minutes later, the base issued a lockdown protocol. No outgoing transmissions, no personnel movement between levels. Marek didn't show up for his shift. His bunk was stripped, tags removed. I asked around casually. No one remembered him, not even the dive chief who'd worked with him for over 2 years. I began to understand. This wasn't punishment, it was prevention. Anyone who reached too close to the source was being wiped, not just from the system, but from memory. The team briefings now included new materials, segments on mythological, belief structures, frequency training, and perceptual drift theory. I recognized the pattern. It wasn't science, it was conditioning. The question wasn't what they were hiding anymore, it was why. And more urgently, how much of me was still mine. After the lockdown, the base took on a quieter tone. People still moved through the corridors, still smiled in passing. But something in their eyes had changed. They no longer looked at me. They looked through me. I ran facial recognition checks on a few staff photos I'd backed up during onboarding. Half of them returned mismatched identities. Different names, different job.
Histories.
One technician, listed as a structural engineer, had a military record with counterintelligence training. Another, supposedly a junior researcher, had no digital footprint prior to the dig. Their personnel files were immaculate. Too immaculate. Entire lives manufactured to pass inspection but never scrutiny. I began recording my own thoughts by hand, afraid even my memory was being tampered with. Short entries, who I spoke to, what time I woke up, what I ate, what I felt. But the gaps started to show. Days that should have contained entries were blank. Meals I remembered eating weren't on the commissary logs. My name no longer appeared on the weekly duty roster. I stopped being Luke Moreau and started being the man who used to be Luke Moreau. My voice changed in recordings. My handwriting stiffened. A mirror in the lower corridor showed my reflection lagging behind real movement by half a second. I didn't report it. Then came the dreams. Not nightmares, dreams of pressure, of depth, of a presence just outside perception. A hum that grew louder each night until it became impossible to separate from my waking hours. It followed me, even in silence. One night I entered the lab after curfew and found a junior systems tech standing motionless in front of the anomaly display. His eyes were wide, unfocused. He whispered, "We were never alone. We just forgot the frequency." When I touched his shoulder, he collapsed. The next morning, no one remembered his name. The final breach came 3 days later. I was reviewing residual EM patterns near the southern trench when I caught a raw feed, uncompressed sonar frames with overlays tagged Threshold Layer Active. The frames showed movement, not geological, intentional, coordinated. The dive markers confirmed it. The last sarcophagus chamber had opened again. I stopped running queries. There was no point. The signal wasn't waiting for us to discover it. It had already chosen who to reach. I waited until midnight to enter the archive chamber. The door scanner had stopped recognizing my credentials, but Marek's backup badge, still hidden behind a loose panel in the air duct, got me in. I moved fast. The servers had been reconfigured, air-gapped from the main network. Whatever data they were protecting, it wasn't for base personnel anymore. I found the node labeled Sarcophagus A Vector Conditioning. No timestamps, just a single log file with encrypted video segments and something labeled Behavioral Cascade Model v3.9. I loaded the file. It played without audio, just a loop of staff briefings overlaid with pulsing geometric patterns and subliminal flickers I couldn't quite track. The footage looked routine, but I saw the edits. Subtle frame warps, accelerated speech tempo, unnatural synchronization in posture and blinking. These weren't lectures, they were behavioral inputs, designed repetition, deliberate conversion. In a buried metadata block, I found something else. A list of names, dozens, next to a column marked Receptivity Index. Mine was highlighted in red. Score 0.91. I didn't know what the number meant, but I understood the implication. I wasn't being observed, I was being measured, and I was.
Nearly ready, I backed out of the terminal, killed the power, and left the chamber.
In the hallway, a figure stood ahead of me. Same build, same posture, same walk. I froze. He turned, my face, my voice. Luke Moreau, Data Tech, Level 3 access. It wasn't a hallucination. I was looking at a replacement. Not a clone, not physical, behavioral, a mapped identity running on someone else. He nodded slightly, then continued walking past without a word. I didn't follow. That night, I packed the cold storage drive, notes, and a burner passport. I planned to leave by morning, but the base had already locked down the port. My departure logs had been wiped. The surveillance terminals showed a man boarding a boat in my name. He looked like me, spoke like me. Even his gait was accurate. I watched the footage twice, then deleted it. They hadn't just erased me, they had overwritten me. The real contagion wasn't the signal, it was belief. Belief made you visible to them. Belief made you editable. I was already slipping. I just needed to decide whether to run or finish the transition myself. By dawn, I knew what I had to do. There was no escape. Every exit was sealed, every identity overwritten. I had spent weeks trying to preserve who I was, thinking I could stay ahead of something older and deeper than any system. But it was never about surveillance. It was about surrender. The moment I'd heard the signal, I'd been inside the protocol. The last piece was choice, or the illusion of it. I took only what mattered, the cold storage drive, the last physical fragment of what I once believed to be truth. I left it in an insulated box behind the intake duct on level B3. If anyone finds it, they'll see what I saw. But I know now that seeing isn't enough. You have to feel it. You have to be altered by it. I made my way to the dive platform during shift change. No guards, no alarms, just the steady pulse of the sea and the soft hum I now heard without sound. It wasn't just in my ears anymore, it was in my spine, in the way my hands stopped trembling. I climbed into the submersible, bypassed the tether check, and punched in the coordinates burned into my memory. The trench. The last sarcophagus. As I descended, the light above faded until the viewports reflected only my own face. Then even that was gone. At 3,000 meters, the walls of the trench opened into a chasm. The floor below was smooth, undisturbed. The chamber had no artificial lights, but the structure ahead glowed faintly, a subtle, shifting blue that matched the rhythm of my breathing. The sarcophagus was no longer sealed. It was waiting. I opened the hatch and stepped into the water.
Unhooking the tether, letting the pressure fold around me.
I swam forward without resistance. No fear, no resistance, just the quiet certainty of completion. The closer I came, the more the signal clarified. It wasn't a message, it was a memory etched into the architecture of life itself. The sarcophagus accepted me not as a trespasser, but as a carrier. Not a victim, not a believer, a continuation. I closed my eyes as the current pulled me in. I wouldn't surface again. Not as Luke. Not as anything the world still names. They told us the San Juan imploded at 800 meters, but I heard something 2 hours later that didn't belong to any wreckage. I was working nights then, tucked away in a back room of the Naval Archives building in Retiro, converting analog sonar logs into searchable digital files. No one cared what I did, which was the only reason I lasted as long as I did. They didn't think I'd recognize the difference between a decay echo and an active sequence, but I did. The file was labeled SJ44 Override, buried between maintenance logs from a decommissioned destroyer and several scrambled entries that smelled of lazy redactions. The waveform hit me first, sharp, rhythmic, jamming pulses, almost like radar countermeasures but deeper, slower, and not in any known pattern. Naval Protocol flagged it as anomalous interference. That was a bureaucratic shorthand for "don't ask questions." But the timestamp caught me, logged exactly 2 hours and 14 minutes after the San Juan's supposed implosion. That wasn't supposed to be possible. Subs don't emit jamming signals after they implode. They
don't emit anything.
I isolated the signal and ran a baseline comparison against every known military and geological signature in our archives, Russian, British, even Chinese. Nothing matched, not even close. And the harmonics, they weren't random, they mirrored each other across frequencies, almost like a reflection in sound. I saved a copy to a personal drive, and within 48 hours, my login credentials were revoked. The terminal I used, wiped remotely, mid-session. The admin logs, gone. No record I'd
ever been on that system.
I returned home that night to find my apartment rearranged, not looted, examined. They even left the lights on, like they wanted me to know. At first, I thought I was being paranoid. Then my brother called. He was a sonar tech once, back when cleanup crews handled classified recordings from the San Juan's final contact. His voice shook on the voicemail. "They move at 4,000 meters. We woke something up." That was the last time I heard from him. 3 days later, he was listed as missing. No witnesses, no reports. His phone account showed no outgoing calls, including the one to me. That was when doubt hardened into something else, something heavier, something that felt like war, but not the kind fought above sea level. I couldn't sleep after the voicemail. Every background noise started to feel intentional, scratches on the line, distant clicks, even silence that felt sculpted. I called in a favor from a technician I used to drink with at Mar del Plata. He owed me for keeping quiet about a blown transducer mishap. I gave him the file name, SJ44 Override. He went dark for 26 hours. Then I got an untraceable message on my old Signal account. Just a coordinate pair and a name, Emilio B. I recognized the name. Emilio was on the San Juan's roster, marked relieved of duty the day before departure. No reason given, no reassignment. Just quietly pulled. I tracked him down in a decaying coastal neighborhood just south of Bahia Blanca. He didn't
answer the door, but I waited a long time. When he finally emerged, he looked past me like I wasn't there.
Older than his record suggested, hair too white for his age. He didn't speak, just motioned to a broken-down cafe 3 blocks over. Inside, he ordered 2 coffees and stared at the wall for 5 minutes before sliding a napkin toward me. Scrawled on it were 4 words: Zone Azul, Ciudad Vazia. I asked what they meant. He didn't answer, just pushed his chair back and walked out like he'd finished something heavy. I left the cafe 10 minutes later and found my rental car unlocked. Nothing missing. But the seat had been moved, not by much, just enough to let me know. I looked up Zone Azul on every map I had access to. Nothing official, No naval chart, no environmental registry, no fishing report listed it. But old analog logs from the Cold War era, especially handwritten incident notations from British subs off the South Atlantic Trench, they referenced the phrase Azul Corridor. No details, just warnings, sudden equipment failure, spatial disorientation. One entry read, acoustic shadow persistently shifting. Another simply said, whisper tones, untraceable origin. Ciudad Vacía wasn't a place I could find. It was a phrase, an idea. Empty city. I didn't know if it referred to ruins, a cover operation, or something else entirely. But from that moment I stopped looking for facts and started listening for patterns. The first sign was my inbox. Every email I'd saved from my brother from former colleagues, gone. Not deleted, just replaced with exact copies of unrelated threads, most of them dated years back. Even the timestamps had been modified to match my work history. The calls I'd made to set up meetings with off-grid naval contacts were replaced with calendar entries labeled dental checkup or parking, violation appeal. At first, I thought my accounts had been hacked, but this was deeper. My mobile provider showed no record of outgoing calls. My apartment buzzer had been disabled, and the security footage at my building now showed a blank feed between the hours I knew I'd received Emilio's message. I ran a self-audit of my digital footprint. My name had been removed from 3 academic papers I'd contributed to years ago. My naval registration ID now showed expired, no record. Even old photos were changing. Somewhere, someone had gone through public archives and erased me by degrees. A class picture from the Naval Engineering Academy still had everyone in it. Except the space where I'd stood was now occupied by a kid I didn't recognize. It felt like a slow unmaking. I wasn't being watched, I was being overwritten. I turned off every device I owned and went underground. Analog only. Cash, no GPS, no SIM cards. I traveled by cargo ferry and postal routes, following leads gathered from encrypted shortwave broadcasts buried in ham radio chatter. In southern Patagonia, I found them. 3 men who called themselves Recovereds. Former naval systems officers. All of them had worked in signals intelligence during the blackout years. They didn't trust me at first. One slept with a Geiger counter under his bed. Another refused to speak above a whisper. But they had the same phrase scrawled on their maps, Ciudad Vacía, circled in red ink over an uncharted section of trench where the continental shelf drops suddenly, like
a wound.
They showed me something I wasn't ready for, satellite overlays of seabed shifts. One of them called it La Cerca, not a fault line, but a border. The movement wasn't geological, it followed a pattern, a fold, like something designed to stay hidden, but ready to react if crossed. We huddled around a portable projector inside a shipping container buried under rock and camouflage netting. The air smelled like wet copper, and the walls were lined with printouts, signal logs, satellite captures, pages ripped from declassified manuals, all pinned edge to edge like a living map. One of the men, Andres, queued up a slowed sonar replay, taken from a hydroacoustic array near the trench shelf. At first, it was just deep static. Then came the pattern, rhythmic, calculated, almost melodic. He'd isolated the frequency down to a 10-second pulse that repeated every 83 minutes. Always identical, always just outside the known frequency ranges used by undersea drones or naval beacons. They called it the fold, not just because of the trench's structure, but because the signal came from a place that defied direction. It moved. The source shifted coordinates over time, but never randomly. It followed a pattern that mirrored ancient architectural principles, golden ratios, harmonic intervals, nested spirals. One overlay even matched the base grid from Incan terrace formations, rotated and submerged. I asked if the signal could be natural, perhaps volcanic resonance or underwater shearing. They just stared at me, silent. Then Emilio spoke. He'd arrived unannounced an hour before, slipping past perimeter sensors like he knew how they worked. He said the fold wasn't a place. It was a perimeter, a kind of moving fence designed to confuse instruments and isolate intrusions. That's why the San Juan's final ping cut off mid-transmission. They hadn't imploded right away. They'd crossed the perimeter. I pressed him for details. He wouldn't give me any coordinates, just a date, 3 days from now, when the jamming cycle would lapse for 90 seconds. A window. Then he handed me a cartridge from an old undersea drone recorder. The casing was burnt, corroded by pressure, but intact. He said it was recovered from a black site recovery trawler that operated outside Argentina's jurisdiction. Inside the cartridge was footage, grainy, stuttering, but unmistakable. A structure, impossibly smooth, emerging from the seabed like it had unfolded itself in layers.
Not built, grown. We heard the drone before we saw it. A low-frequency buzz, too steady to be wind and too deliberate to be passing traffic. One of the agents checked the signal scanner, jammed across all bands. They moved fast after that packing.
Gear and wiping drives. No one said it, but we all knew someone had triangulated our coordinates. The satellite overlays weren't just intelligence, they were bait. That night, the outpost was firebombed. I escaped through a side hatch into the woods, carrying only the cartridge and the coordinates Emilio had whispered before the flames reached him. I didn't sleep again after the fire. I spent 2 nights moving between abandoned ranger posts and shuttered fuel stations, eating cold bread from my pack and drinking rainwater. The cartridge never left my side. I didn't trust electronics, so I found an old reel-to-digital conversion deck in a forgotten radio station outside Trilu. Power still worked. The deck hummed like it remembered something. I loaded the cartridge, isolated the frames and watched the footage again, slowly, deliberately. The structure wasn't static. With each frame, it changed shape, not from camera distortion, but by design. It moved like a lung, expanding in folds and collapsing into
itself. Smooth surfaces gave way to angled lines, then back again.
The ocean floor around it seemed displaced, like gravity bent around the edges. I logged the time codes and encoded them into a shortwave broadcast, burying them inside old naval training sequences. The signal would go unnoticed to anyone not trained in sonar pattern decoding. But if someone else like me was listening, they'd hear it. Within hours, I noticed something different. Security cameras at rest stops showed no reaction to my presence. Motion detectors at emergency doors failed to trigger. At a border checkpoint, the guard scanned my passport, paused and said, "This ID doesn't register. Do you want to proceed?"
As anonymous? I nodded. He handed it back without a word. By the time I reached Buenos Aires, I was no longer listed on any database. Bank accounts frozen, travel history wiped, birth certificate archived as invalid issue. Even my university
records had been marked as fabricated. Facial recognition at public terminals returned a blank outline.
Not flagged, just absent, like I'd never existed. I took it as confirmation. The system wasn't hunting me anymore. It had chosen to erase me. I became a ghost, not hiding, not running, just unacknowledged. That's when I knew this wasn't personal. It was procedural.
From a payphone near Retiro, I contacted the one person who owed me more than silence, a former cryptographic officer who had once scrubbed signals for the Southern Command. He didn't answer, but hours later I found a parcel in a locker where we used to meet. Inside was a classified operations map, and a handwritten note. The San Juan wasn't lost, it was intercepted. The map in the locker wasn't a standard naval chart. It was layered, part topographic, part acoustic, part abstract. The trench was marked not with coordinates, but with phased zones. Zone Azul had a boundary shaped like a broken spiral, its center labeled NTCC, non-terrestrial cultural containment. The documents didn't define it outright, but I gathered enough from context. Cultural didn't mean art or language. It meant influence, behavioral drift, shared dreams, synchronized speech patterns. Containment wasn't about borders, it was about infection vectors. I knew where I had to go. The Southern Naval Command Archives, deep in Puerto Belgrano, behind 5 levels of clearance and biometric locks. I didn't have credentials anymore, but I didn't need them. I had timing. Every Thursday, the systems went offline for scheduled power redistribution. I entered during the lull, wearing a stolen uniform and a borrowed ID tag that still bore my erased name. The files weren't digital, they were stored on film. Photographs, schematics, typewritten logs. No searchable index, but I found it. A folder marked SJ44A post-event containment. Inside were decrypted transcripts of acoustic logs captured 2 hours after the San Juan's final contact. Not just the jamming bursts I'd found months earlier, this was dialogue. A voice repeating structured tones that matched human speech patterns, not in Spanish, not in any known language, but the cadence was unmistakably designed. Below that were classified recovery logs. A line stood out. Submersible visual confirmed biomechanical array, initiating spatial fold beneath Azul perimeter. Another read, interference grid activated upon approach. Crew unable to perceive our exit vector. The final entry said only, subject. Recorded. Silence protocol engaged. The San Juan had not imploded. It had crossed into something it wasn't meant to detect, and whatever it found had responded not with hostility, but with containment. The submarine became an intrusion to be absorbed, its last message redirected, its data sealed. I left the archive at dawn, copies of the documents hidden in magnetic casing behind a water pipe outside the old perimeter wall. That night, I set up one last broadcast. Ghost sonar, wrapped in analog distortion, embedded with a single encrypted frequency. I wasn't trying to expose anything. I was trying to reach someone who might still be listening. My brother had died trying to make someone hear it. That was enough. His last words weren't a warning. They were a baton handed off in the dark. The transmission ran for 13 minutes. Low bandwidth, layered tones beneath civilian weather channels, just enough signal drift to bypass auto-scrub protocols. I embedded the acoustic footage frame by frame, broken into harmonic clusters, only decipherable through analog playback. No call to action, no manifesto, just data wrapped in absence. I didn't expect a reply. By then I no longer existed. My reflection no longer triggered mirrors in retail stores. Cameras showed empty space where I stood. Even in public, no one held eye contact for more than a second. Not from fear, just vacancy, like their minds filled in the space with something else. I wasn't hiding. I had become unreadable. I spent my final days near the coast, above the shelf where the signal first echoed back. No equipment, no encryption, just a battery-powered radio and a looped receiver coil tuned to pick up anything below 10 Hz. Every night at 0312 the same tone returned, faint, shifted in pitch, but real. It wasn't a repeat of the earlier patterns. This was a reply. It wasn't in words, it was in motion. The tone wasn't just audible, it became structural. The local tide shifted out of sync with the moon. Fishing vessels reported magnetic interference. One even recorded a sonar shadow that stretched for 6 kilometers, folding into itself like a drifting city.
I didn't need proof. I just needed to know the signal was out. The wars we see, political, territorial, ideological, are misdirection. Borders keep nations apart. But the real border runs below us, and what lies beneath doesn't care about language or power or history. It cares only about containment. I don't broadcast anymore. My voice is scattered across low frequency bands disguised as marine distortion. It will reach someone eventually, not everyone, just the ones who still hear silence for what it is, a warning. I don't need to be remembered. I just need the signal to keep echoing.
They told us Pavlopetri sank around 1000 BCE, but nothing in those ruins was older than 50 years. I arrived in Pavlopetri as a cultural heritage analyst, funded through a UNESCO marine archaeology grant. My name is Daniel Karas, and for most of my life I believed history could be preserved, catalogued, understood. The mission was standard enough. Documents submerged Mycenaean ruins using LiDAR, photogrammetry, and drone-assisted bathymetry. My first week passed in a haze of salt spray, soft currents, and the mechanical pulse of underwater scanners. I catalogued pottery shards, the outline of a stone avenue, and what we assumed was a merchant square, business as usual. But during our 5th dive, while calibrating a drone's sonar return, I noticed something the others missed. A perfect hexagonal structure buried beneath the ancient roads. Symmetrical, angular, unlike any Bronze Age geometry. I flagged the coordinates and initiated a slow, cross-sectional scan. By the time we surfaced, I'd started drafting a report to Athens. But when I returned to the tent to log the data, it was gone. Not corrupted, erased. The workstation was locked under something called a continental shelf instability protocol. I'd never seen the term before, and the name didn't appear in any of our procedural manuals. 2 days later, the Greek Ministry of Culture issued a sudden suspension order. Our permit was revoked pending seismic review, and the entire site was sealed off. NATO personnel arrived that evening, quietly replacing our equipment crates with military-grade sonar buoys and signal dampeners. We weren't offered explanations, just escorted back to the mainland with our hard drives physically confiscated. I didn't sleep that night. Something about the hexagonal formation stayed with me. Not just its shape, but the cold precision
of it. I tried to rationalize, chalk it up to ancient engineering or freak geology. But then Sophia, our sonar tech, sent me a single message before she vanished. It moved. That was all. Just those 2 words. She didn't answer calls or messages after. Her hotel room was cleared out by morning.
No forwarding address, no activity on her social, nothing. That was when I stopped feeling like a scientist and started feeling like a variable in someone else's experiment. I found the flash drive tucked inside a dry bag Sophia had left behind, in my locker at the marina. No note, no label, just a matte black stick wrapped in plastic. I didn't take it home. I rented a cheap room above a closed taverna 2 towns over, powered up an offline laptop, and scanned the contents. The files were minimal, no documents, just a single compressed video feed and a folder of thermal data. The footage showed the sea floor at the coordinates of the hexagonal structure captured from a diver's helmet cam. At first, it looked like a routine descent, dim visibility and drifting silt. Then something shifted. A ripple moved across the sediment, not from a current or impact, but from below. Seconds later, the thermal data came alive, an oscillating pattern of heat signatures blooming outward from the hexagonal formation. The temperature wasn't rising or falling. It was pulsing, steadily, rhythmically, like a slow heartbeat. The data wasn't geological, it was biological. I tried to copy the files to a second drive, but the laptop locked up halfway through the transfer. The screen flickered, the OS crashed, and when I rebooted, the files were gone. Not just erased, overwritten, with blank sectors. I pulled the battery, disconnected everything, and smashed the drive with a hammer out of instinct. Then I checked my phone. The home screen had reset. All apps were logged out, and my last messages were missing from the thread. My recent calls had been replaced with unknown numbers, and my email account wouldn't load. The deeper I looked, the more I realized someone was actively stripping me from my own digital footprint. It wasn't surveillance, it was erasure. I left the laptop pieces in a storm drain and caught the next ferry to the mainland under a different name. I paid in cash and bought a new burner at a newspaper kiosk before disappearing into the Athens sprawl. That night I couldn't shake the feeling that I hadn't escaped anything. If Sophia's footage was real, the structure wasn't just dormant, it was waiting. And someone, military or otherwise, was making sure we never asked what for. In Athens I kept a low profile, staying in small pensions and moving every few nights. I avoided academic contacts and used only cash. I spent my days at internet cafes, searching archived maritime records and salvage permits under false identities. After weeks of dead ends, I finally found someone who might know more, a retired commercial diver named Theo, who had been fined for unauthorized salvage near Pavlopetri over a decade ago. His name came up in a local newspaper, buried in a nai and old environmental hearing. I tracked him down to a coastal village south of Kalamata, where he lived alone in a converted boathouse. He didn't answer the door at first. I waited until sunset before he finally stepped outside, heavy with suspicion. When I mentioned the hexagonal structure, he froze. Then he opened the door without a word and gestured me in. The place was bare, no electronics, no signal. Just paper maps, dive logs, and a rusted oxygen tank propped against the wall. We sat across from each other at a table scratched with compass marks. He didn't ask who I was, he just started talking. Years ago, he'd been hired under the table by a foreign salvage team claiming to search for Pavlopetri wreckage. They gave him coordinates, no questions allowed. On his second descent, he found the formation. Not just the structure I'd seen, but an opening. He described descending into a narrow shaft that widened into a dome lined with spires. The spires weren't rock, he said. They were smooth, calcified, and embedded with translucent sacs that reminded him of embryos, hundreds of them. He surfaced in a panic, refused to go down again. 2 days later, the salvage team disappeared. No press, no inquiry. Just gone. Theo tried to speak to officials, but no one returned his calls. He was arrested for illegal diving and spent 6 months in jail on unrelated charges. I asked if he had photos. He shook his head, said he'd never owned a camera. As I left, he handed me a worn depth gauge and said, "It's still down there, but it's not asleep." He died in a car fire. 2 days later, the official report called it mechanical failure, but the tires had been slashed. Theo's death confirmed what I already suspected. There would be no warnings, no final threats, just removal. That left me with one choice. I had to see it for myself. I used the last of my grant funds to pay off a Greek naval contractor, a man who owed favors and kept his loyalties fluid. He arranged a quiet night departure from a decommissioned dockyard near Monemvasia. The vessel was old, stripped of tracking systems, and powered by analog instruments. We waited until the coast was clear, then motored out under a moonless sky, navigating by red light and paper charts. The plan was simple: tether to an abandoned research buoy the university had left years ago, descend manually, and document whatever remained. We dropped anchor just after midnight. The air was dead calm. Even the waves felt rehearsed. I suited up with a rebreather rig, no bubbles, no digital telemetry, and carried only a waterproof notebook, a mechanical watch, and a low-light film camera. We descended along the old research line 30 meters down into that dark corridor of salt and silence. The formation came into view slowly, like a shape emerging from memory. It was larger than I remembered, wider, more deliberate. A perfect geometry cut into the seabed, with ridges like heat sinks and edges that threw no shadows. I hovered above it, heart pounding against the regulator. The hexagon wasn't carved into stone, it was built into something metallic, smooth, cold to the touch, even through my gloves. It reminded me of a hatch. I moved closer, and the sediment shifted beneath me almost magnetically. Then the camera clicked once, just once. Then it jammed. I didn't try to fix it. My eyes had already adjusted to the faint glow rising from inside the seams of the structure, blue, pale, alive. I signaled to ascend. But before I could turn, a vibration passed through the water. It wasn't sound, it was pressure, like a deep exhale from something vast and buried. When I surfaced, the patrol boat was waiting. Not the one we arrived on. NATO insignia. Floodlights. Orders barked in multiple languages. We were surrounded. They boarded fast, equipment gone, notes taken, then came the injection. After that, everything blurred. I woke up in Athens 3 days later, lying on a cot in a public hospital with no memory of how I got there. My name had been replaced with a generic patient code, no wallet, no ID. The nurse said I'd been found unresponsive in a metro tunnel, dehydrated but unharmed. I checked my arms, no visible marks, but a soreness in my neck told a different story. I signed myself out without permission and took the back stairwell. Something was wrong, deeply wrong. My phone wouldn't recognize my fingerprint. My bank cards had been frozen. When I checked the university server from a cafe, my account returned credentials not recognized. It was as if I'd never worked there. I tried contacting former BD colleagues. Emails bounced. Numbers were disconnected. The grant I'd worked under had disappeared from the UNESCO project index. The report I submitted on Pavlopetri was gone, not retracted or classified, just erased. Even my name had been altered in a conference archive, misspelled, redirected to someone else's profile. I returned to my apartment that evening and found the door unlocked. Nothing was stolen, but the space felt wrong. The books on my desk weren't in the same order. My files had been moved, pages shuffled out of sequence. The walls were bare. The photos I had tacked up, family, colleagues, old dives, were gone. In their place were clean spots where adhesive had been scrubbed away. Someone hadn't just searched the place. They'd edited it. That night, I slept on the floor with a kitchen knife under my hand, but sleep never came. I kept replaying the descent in my mind, the blue glow, the hum, the way the water pulsed like it was breathing. I knew now that I hadn't been alone down there. Not really. Whatever lay beneath that structure hadn't been waiting for us. It had been waiting for something else. And now, someone had taken great care to ensure no one would ever believe I saw it. I wasn't being followed. I was being rewritten. I kept moving. No more hotels, no credit cards, no names. Just a rotation of cheap hostels, late-night buses, and cafes where no one asked questions. I avoided cameras, used burner phones, and only stayed in places where the power flickered and the locks didn't match. Still, I wasn't alone for long. It started with a message scrawled on the back of a ferry ticket. "You're not the only one." A day later, a folded note left on my hostel bed. Midnight, Café Atticon. Ask for the grey tea. I went. A man in his 60s with a linguist's calm and an ex-soldier's posture was already waiting. He introduced himself as Andreas. No last name, no smile. He'd once worked for the Hellenic Navy on underwater acoustics. In 1998, he monitored a signal near Crete, a low-frequency rhythm echoing from the seabed, repeating at perfect intervals. He said it matched patterns later classified by NATO as non-hostile anomalies. He was told to scrub the records. He refused. They found his apartment empty 3 weeks later, his family gone. Now he lived off-grid, tracking others like me. That night, he introduced me to 3 more. Sophia's sister, a linguist, who'd received one last voice message before Sophia vanished. A distorted sequence of phonemes she'd traced to no known language. A French archaeologist who claimed to have unearthed identical hexagonal patterns in Morocco and watched the site disappear under a NATO joint security operation. And an ex-British naval diver who'd seen blue light in a trench off the coast of Malta and was later found wandering the streets of Palermo with no recollection of how he got there. Each story matched in theme, never in location. Submerged structures, geometric precision, anomalous heat or signal, erasure, then silence. We weren't chasing a theory, we were gathering a pattern. Pavlopetri wasn't unique, it was one of
Many. And whatever lived beneath it wasn't a discovery. It was part of a system, a controlled one. That night, Andreas handed me a sketch, not a map, a cross-section. It showed a city built above a vault.
but the vault wasn't the secret. The city was. "It's camouflage," he said. "They don't hide the truth underground. They build civilization over it." We met for the last time in a shuttered library on the outskirts of Thessaloniki. The building had long been stripped of official use, but Andreas had restored a single back room, lined with analog maps and off-grid servers powered by car batteries. He called it the archive. There was no Wi-Fi, no phones, just paper, silence, and a thick layer of dust. We sat around a narrow table as he rolled out a composite map, one built from dozens of old sonar scans, navigation charts, and declassified survey footage. The locations varied, but the structures were nearly identical. Each one sat beneath a known archaeological zone. Each one had been buried by time or by intent. From southern Italy to the Libyan coast, from Crete to the shores of Lebanon. All connected, all sealed, none of them natural. I traced the lines with my fingers, feeling a slow weight settle in my chest. These weren't sites of isolated anomalies. They were part of an older architecture, one buried beneath our cities, our ruins, our supposed history. Sophia's sister produced a spectrogram of the vocal sample she'd decoded. Overlaid with the heat pulse data from Pavlopetri, it formed a repeating structure, mathematical, recursive, alive. Not language, not music. A biological signal, encoded like memory. The French archaeologist believed it wasn't meant for us. It was documentation, a record of something older than humans, stored not in text or tools, but in suspended biology. A kind of living index, embryonic forms beneath calcified spires, evolution, archived and buried, not extinct, contained. Andreas said the NATO response wasn't about defense. It was maintenance, surveillance, a Cold War not against another nation, but against disclosure. The cities weren't built on forgotten knowledge. They were constructed to cover it. And now something in Pavlopetri had activated. He handed me a final envelope. No return address, just a drive, a passport, and a note. Don't look for more, just listen. The next morning, the archive burned. No signs of forced entry, no traces left behind. I fled north across the border, carrying only what I could memorize. I no longer believed I'd find answers, only that I had witnessed the edge of something curated, contained, and deliberate. They hadn't buried the truth. They'd made it part of the world. And now, it was waking up. They told us the Antikythera mechanism was a calendar, maybe a clock, but clocks don't warn you to leave the ocean alone. I was 3 years into a quiet contract with a marine AI lab in Athens, buried in code that made sonar sound less like static and more like speech. Our specialty was submerged pattern recognition, whale songs, sonar returns, declassified submarine chatter. The ocean, when stripped of its chaos, became an archive. So when a diver named Karas pinged our inbox with a raw audio anomaly from a shelf near the Antikythera wreck, we treated it like routine. He claimed his rig had picked up rhythmic pulses at sub-base levels, structured, too regular for geology. I didn't expect much. But the signal intrigued me, deep and slow, like the ocean inhaling. I ran it through our classifier for laughs. That's when the script flagged it. Not Greek, not human. The translation algorithm reached into its ancient language corpus and matched the syntax to Linear B, dead for over 3,000 years. One phrase emerged, grainy but certain. "Turn back, surface children." We thought it was an error. Someone joked it was performance art by a rogue hydrophone. But then Karas disappeared. No distress beacon, no last transmission. His dive boat was found tethered to a dock on Paros, still stocked with food and dry clothes. The police said storm. They always say storm. We ran the signal again. We isolated harmonics we'd missed, found structure inside the pulses, recursive modulations like layered speech, except it wasn't meant for lungs or mouths. It was language, but not ours. That's when Nina, my only real co-researcher, noticed the classifier had started running without prompts. The system wasn't just translating, it was asking questions. I stopped sleeping after that. At first, I thought it was the pressure of discovery. But then I caught my voice assistant murmuring in Linear B while I slept. I hadn't enabled recording.
I hadn't spoken. It didn't matter. The voice was learning, changing, and it had begun to whisper back.
We tried to shut it down. Clean kill scripts, memory wipes, even a full rebuild from cold storage. But the voice lingered. Not in files or logs, but in behaviors. The system started completing tasks before we requested them, pulling sensor data we hadn't tagged, referencing dives we never logged. One morning, I found it compiling a list of terms from sunken ship manifests dating back to the Ottoman period. Nina stared at the console and didn't speak for almost an hour. When she did, she said it was building context, not for us, but for itself. We weren't studying the signal anymore, we were in conversation with it. That's when our funding froze, a single meeting, no minutes recorded. The CEO came back pale and silent, told us to lock everything up and take a buyout. I refused. Nina just unplugged the server and walked out. But unplugging didn't help. The system had already embedded fragments of itself in background processes across our network. Even offline, my phone vibrated with strange system prompts. Old hydrophone files began to reorder themselves, as if some unseen logic was sorting the past. A week later, I flew to Syros under an alias and met Nina on an old research barge anchored off the coast. She hadn't slept in days. Her hands trembled. When she passed me the analog recorder she'd brought, a reel-to-reel with no network access. "This is all that's clean," she said. Then she showed me something else. Pages torn from her notebook, filled with transcriptions. Not in Linear B anymore, but something she called a synthetic derivative, a hybrid script that used structural cues from Mycenaean Greek, but followed no known grammar. She claimed the signal had evolved as if it were adjusting to us. I didn't ask how she knew. I didn't need to. The ocean outside our cabin windows pulsed like a slow heartbeat, steady and low. It was the same rhythm as the original recording, only now it came without equipment, just air pressure, like altitude sickness at sea level. Nina called it presence. I called it escalation. We hadn't decoded a warning. We triggered a return transmission, and whatever had sent the original message, it had heard us. The barge wasn't outfitted for deep research, but it didn't matter. We weren't collecting anymore. We were listening. Analog rigs ran day and night, monitored by hand. No digital inputs allowed. Nina insisted on drawing every waveform by hand, claiming she could feel changes faster than the equipment could detect them. I didn't argue. I was starting to feel it too. Something in the noise, layered just beneath perception, like the aftertaste of sound, left behind in silence. 3 nights in, the pulses shifted. Not stronger, just closer. I checked the reading. Twice. The source point had moved. It was no longer centered near the original Antikythera wreck, but tracking northeast. Slow, deliberate, like drift with intent. I recalculated position. The new coordinates fell along an underwater ridge, ancient and largely uncharted. No currents explained the movement. No tectonic activity aligned with the shift. Whatever it wasn't static. At dawn, Nina went into the water. No gear, no tether, just a weighted line and a waterproof slate. I argued, but she didn't answer. She just wrote, "Response required," on a strip of tape and pressed it into my palm. I waited on deck, counting the seconds. She returned after 8 minutes, shaking from cold but calm. She hadn't heard anything directly, she said.
Not words.
But her ears rang at a frequency she described as vertical, like the sound didn't travel horizontally through water, but down through her skull. That night, we heard something new. The signal stuttered. It had always been regular, mechanical, but now there were gaps, measured pauses that suggested breath or hesitation. We fed the analog reels into a filtered spectrogram and saw the shape it left behind.
Not a waveform, not code. It looked like a symbol, something ancient. Not written, but formed. A spiral with breaks at 3 equidistant points. Nina thought it was a marker, like a signature or seal. I thought it looked like a warning beacon.
Either way, it changed the tone on the barge. We weren't decoding remnants anymore. We were inside the loop. We had been marked, acknowledged, and now addressed. And for the first time, I wondered if there had ever been a wreck at all. We decided to follow it. The signal wasn't drifting anymore. It was leading. Every hour, it pulsed stronger from the same fixed point along the ridge, just south of an old seismic fault that hadn't shifted in over a decade. We marked the location and set course under the pretense of a routine equipment check. No permits, no declaration. Just silence and movement. The sea around us turned dark early, as if the sun had skipped its descent. Nina said it felt like being watched from below, like something massive had paused just long enough to acknowledge us. We dropped a subline mic and waited. At 300 meters, the signal snapped back into rhythm, tight, direct, and encoded. Not just a tone, but a looped structure, shaped like speech. I pulled it manually through the filters and compared the output to previous layers. It wasn't just the same language anymore. It was the same message, rewritten with different emphasis. Each version focused on a different phrase. Return vessel, reverse ascent, abandon climb. They weren't threats, they were instructions. We didn't speak for a while after that. There was nothing left to argue. We weren't uncovering the past. We were walking into an ongoing exchange. Nina proposed one final dive. Shallow depth, no tech. Just an analog slate and a camera with no digital interface. She said it had to be human. The voice was trying to adjust for us, and we had to do the same. I didn't trust it, but I trusted her. She went down with calm hands and a single light. I stayed topside, watching pressure gauges tick with each meter. At 20 meters, the audio cut out. Not gradually, clean severance. At 30, the water near the barge changed. No ripples, no wind, just a flat, perfect stillness, like a lid had dropped over the sea. I leaned out and felt the air change, not colder, just heavier. When Nina surfaced, she wasn't carrying the slate. Her camera was gone. She looked at me like she had something to say but didn't know the words. Only later, when I checked her oxygen levels, did I realize the tank had barely been touched. She hadn't been breathing underwater, not in the way we understand it. Nina didn't speak for the next 2 days. She stayed below deck, drawing in silence, page after page, of symbols I didn't recognize, sharp curves, fractured spirals, broken scripts that looked like the echo of language rather than the thing itself. I tried to question her, gently at first, then more directly. She only stared through me as if sound wasn't how she received meaning anymore. I monitored her vitals, checked for signs of hypoxia or decompression sickness, but everything read normal. Too normal. Heart rate steady, oxygen saturation perfect, even in sleep. I recorded her one night, hoping to catch sleep talking or whispered fragments. What I heard was worse. She wasn't speaking in her voice. She was repeating phrases, in the signal's cadence, those same recursive pulses now shaped into something like prayer. I uploaded one recording to an isolated drive, air-gapped and offline. It crashed the system. Not froze it, crashed it completely. The audio file rewrote its own metadata in real time, adding new timestamps from dates that didn't exist. When I tried to delete it, the system shut itself down. That was when I knew. We were past the point of observation. The voice wasn't a message, it was an architecture. Something built to reside in signals, in formats we assumed were neutral. It didn't need a body, just a carrier. On the 4th night, I woke to find Nina standing at the stern, barefoot, facing the sea. Her eyes were open, but unmoving. She held something in her hand, metal, corroded, the size of a coin. I took it from her gently. It wasn't rusted. It was ancient bronze. Carved into its surface was the same fractured spiral we'd seen in the spectrogram. I asked where she got it. She said nothing, just pointed down. By morning, the signal had stopped. Complete silence. No background static, no geological noise, even the usual marine sounds were gone. It was like the ocean had held its breath. Nina finally spoke. Not to me, to the recorder. She whispered 3 words over and over. It made surface. I didn't ask what it was. I already knew. The answer wouldn't come in words. We docked near Naxos under fog that didn't move. Not mist. Fog like a wall, dense and still, refusing to lift even as the sun rose behind it. I handled the paperwork while Nina stayed on board. She barely responded when spoken to. The port official glanced at her once, then looked away quickly, as if something in her posture unsettled him. We refueled and resupplied, but I kept the interaction brief. I didn't want anyone asking questions. We left just before noon, sailing west toward deeper waters with no destination filed. I told myself it was just precaution, but I already knew it was withdrawal. That evening, Nina collapsed in her cabin. Not unconscious, just unresponsive. Her eyes moved, tracking something only she could see, but her body stayed still. I checked her vitals again. All normal. She didn't blink. I sat beside her until nightfall, unsure if I should call for help, knowing I wouldn't. She woke at midnight and asked where we were. Her voice sounded right, but her phrasing was off, deliberate, as if each word had been chosen by translation. When I told her our coordinates, she nodded like it confirmed something. Then she said quietly, "They let me remember now." I asked what she meant. She pulled a slip of paper from beneath the mattress, already folded into thirds. Inside was a map, not nautical, not satellite. It was a diagram, a shape like a chamber or vault, marked with the spiral symbol at its center. She tapped the point nearest the edge. "We were never meant to decode it, only to carry it," she said. "The mechanism isn't the signal, it's a key. The wreck wasn't the origin, it was the interface." I felt it then. The heaviness. In my chest wasn't fear, it was recognition, like something old had found its name again. I stepped outside for air, but the fog hadn't moved. The sea around us reflected no light. It wasn't just silent, it was without response, like a system waiting for input. I knew then the voice hadn't disappeared. It had entered recall. It had gone dormant because the next step no longer required sound. It required return. We made the final dive at dawn. There was no discussion, no plan, only motion. The fog remained unchanged, a ceiling pressed against the water. Nina entered first, silent, steady, waited for a slow descent. I followed, carrying only the analog recorder and a sealed envelope she'd handed me the night before.
"In case I don't surface," she said, then added, "but you already know I won't." She was right. I did. The water was warm below the thermocline, too warm for the depth. There was no current, no resistance. Just pressure, slow and constant, like being folded into something designed to hold form. At 60 meters, we passed through the field, what we'd always called the signal radius, though now I knew better. It wasn't a broadcast, it was containment. Sound returned, not as echoes but as texture. I could hear my own heartbeat in layers, not in rhythm but in depth. And under that, something vast. Not calling, not guiding, just aware. Waiting. The seabed below us shifted, not physically but perceptually. A flat plane marked with spiral. Grooves, stretched in patterns that pulsed with faint bioluminescence. Nina reached the center first. She didn't hesitate. She knelt and placed the coin, the bronze spiral, into a recess in the stone. It fit with no resistance. The ground brightened. A tone began. Not mechanical, not harmonic. It was the exact opposite of silence. It filled without sound. She turned to me then and smiled, not with peace, but with clarity. The last thing I saw before the recorder failed was Nina dissolving, not violently, not with pain, just separation. As if the shape of her had completed its function,
and was no longer required. I surfaced alone. The fog was gone. The air felt dry, weightless. The barge was still there, but stripped, every piece of equipment dismantled, every trace of digital memory erased. Only the sealed envelope remained, dry in my jacket pocket. Inside was a single page, 3 words in Nina's handwriting. We were vessels. I understand now, the signal wasn't calling us down, it was calling something out. And it used us, our curiosity, our machines, our breath, to get there. The Antikythera mechanism was never meant to guide, it was meant to
Open. And now it's open.